Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to explore a deeply tragic and haunting case together. We engage with strangers on a daily basis. Every person is unknown to us before that initial conversation. Afterward, we might refer to them as acquaintances, friends, or even significant others. While we shouldn't live in fear of others, some individuals are monsters concealed behind friendly appearances. Unfortunately, for some, by the time they realize it, it's already too late. I want to introduce you to Rebecca Koster. Her friends and her family refer to her as Becky and Becca, among other things like cute pet names, Becca Boo and Becky Boo, like her mom would call her. She was born on June 12, 1985, a June baby, like myself. Her mother, Barbara Miller, was beyond enamored, looking into her newborn baby girl's eyes for the very first time. Barbara said, "From the minute she came into this world, Becky was just the sweetest thing. I mean, look at those big beautiful eyes, those cute pouty lips, a head full of dark hair, and her olive skin. She was her mother's joy. She brightened her life in the world as soon as she entered it." As Becky got older, she remained with that sweet disposition and kind nature. Barbara noticed that Becky wouldn't even hurt the smallest creature. She said she couldn't even hurt a fly. When Becky was 9, her brother Damon was born, and that's when Barbara said the two of them became a trio, and it was a lot of fun. Barbara was very close to her children, especially Becky, having all those years with her before Damon came along. Her world revolved around giving Becky the best that she could. They were more than just mother and daughter, they were best friends. Barbara was a single mom until she met and fell in love with Larry Ross. They hit it off and had so much in common, and they were definitely very much in love. Both he and Becky had June birthdays, so many times the family would celebrate them together. Here is one of those birthday cakes, with Larry and Becky's picture on it. Larry considered Becky his daughter, even though he wasn't her biological father. The family was very close. Ultimately, Barbara Miller became Barbara Ross when she married Larry, and Becky looked gorgeous as she watched her mother exchange vows with Larry, now officially her stepdad. Becky and her mom loved roses. It was their favorite flower. Becky wore a pretty pink rose flower crown to her mother's wedding. Pink was also her favorite color. Many times she would wear pink eyeshadow, nails, jewelry, and heels. She was definitely a girly girl. She also loved butterflies. In these pictures you can just tell she radiates happiness. She and Damon look so adorable, and I can tell how excited Becky was for her mother's wedding. This embrace says it all. They just rocked back and forth, hugging on the dance floor, a little mother-daughter dance. They lived on Falcon Avenue in Medford. Larry worked as a truck parts salesman, Barbara worked shifts at the hospital, and Becky attended Medford High School, only a 99-minute drive from their house. And when she was 14 years old, she met Nicole Longo. Nicole was new to the area at the time, but she was so happy to have met Becky because they became inseparable. They were truly best friends, and over the years, they grew up together. Nicole called Becky her soulmate. She didn't think that soulmates only referred to someone's boyfriend, husband, or partner. Instead, Nicole believed that soulmates can be anyone with whom you have such a strong, unbreakable connection. And that's what these two girls had. They bonded over what most high schoolers do, sleepovers, where they would stay up all night talking to each other until they fell asleep. Walking around the neighborhood at night with other girls, just laughing, making memories, and inside jokes. Becky was a loyal friend. She was always there when you needed her, even if it was just to help pass some time in detention. Yes, she sat through Nicole's detentions with her, and that made them a lot more tolerable. Becky was always by her side through thick and thin. She was easy to get along with because she saw the good in everyone. She quickly merged into Nicole's friend group as well. At first, Nicole's friends from back home, like another friend, Nikki, were sad when Nicole moved away. But when she introduced Nikki to Becky, the move was worth it because they gained another amazing friend. Soon, the three of them became the two Nicks and Becca. Over the years, they formed a core group of friends and hung out all the time. Becky enjoyed helping others. It either came naturally to her, or it could have been something to do with her mom, because Barbara was a CNA, a certified nursing assistant, and it's not an easy job. It takes a lot of patience and being a very helpful, loving person who cares for others, and that's part of who Barbara was. That seemed to rub off on Becky. She would happily babysit her mom's friends' kids, help braid her friends' hair when they came over to hang out, and even babysit for her friends' kids in the summer as they got older and started families of their own. But Becky just had the look and the personality that left an impression on people, even those she barely knew. If you met her even once, you would remember her face. She was what people would call unforgettable. With that cute freckled face and bubbly personality, it definitely attracted the boys as well. Becky was no stranger to having boyfriends. The guys were always trying to flirt, talk, and date Becky. She was very popular and gorgeous, but humble. Her friends would tell her how pretty she was all the time and how other girls were jealous of her. But once they got to know her, they couldn't stay jealous because she was just too nice. After high school, Becky decided she wanted to work in the healthcare industry alongside her mom at the hospital. So she, too, studied to become a CNA, passed a test, and landed a job in the cardiology department at the same hospital in the same department as her mother. Becky and Barbara lived together, worked together, and hung out together. People saw them more like sisters than mother and daughter. When they weren't putting in the long hours at the hospital, they were shopping together, cooking, and curled up next to one another on the couch watching a movie. Becky always confided in her mother, and as she got older and more independent, she still made sure to keep in touch with her mom every single day. She let her know her plans, where she would be, when she would be coming home, and would call or text her when she got back from anywhere, running errands or going out with friends. She made even more friends at work. One of them was Jamie Redis, who was just drawn to Becky right away because of her bubbly personality. They became instant friends, and Jamie admired the way Becky treated every patient like it was her own family member. It showed that she was a genuinely loving person. In 2006, when Becky was 21, she dated a guy named Jay, but it didn't last that long. As Becky progressed in life, her standards got higher. Her friends would joke when they went out that they only talked to guys who had business cards. They were just being cute and cheeky, but Becky was known for her witty banter, cracking jokes, and making her friends laugh. She was the friend that would get out there on the dance floor by herself and do silly things to make everyone smile. She made things fun. Friends said you couldn't be sad around Becky. It was impossible. She would find a way to cheer you up. That's why so many people gravitated towards her. She just didn't have a bad day. She knew how to be grateful, and many people would turn to her when they needed uplifting or positivity in their lives. Case in point, there were times Becky would steal some bologna from her mom's sandwiches, hide it in her purse for later, and then when she was hanging out with her friends, she would just magically slip this piece of bologna out of her bag and start munching on it. They'd be like, "Where did that come from?" And she would say, "Right here. You want some bologna?" I can just picture her saying this with a big smile and just laughing. It's like she created those try not to laugh moments without even trying. People want to be around someone who makes them feel good, and she did everything with her girls. They even got matching tongue piercings. Hers was pink with a butterfly on it, combining two of her favorite things. She definitely had a spunky personality and a sense of humor. Here she is on her 23rd birthday in June of 2008, decked out in everything pink. The earrings, the tank top, the heels. She loved fashion and would talk about her dream of either being a painter or designing her own club fashion clothing line. Jokingly, she said she would call it skank attire. Even though her friends knew she was joking, they knew she would be great at whatever she chose to do. By 2009, Becky was 24 and single again. That was okay because she had a lot of other things going on. Her main focus was work and, of course, spending time with family and friends. She had a very active social life. Her close-knit group of friends loved going out to local bars for some drinks and dancing. It was a routine for them. When they had free time, they would take the opportunity to get together and meet up, usually a town away in Holbrook, just a 5-minute drive from Medford. There was an Irish pub they liked to go to called the Irish Times, and an alehouse called Kelly's. One of their other go-to places for a bite to eat, playing some pool and drinks, was called Butcher Boy's Bar and Grill. I think it's pretty similar to what most of us enjoy: good food, friends, and fun times. Friends would say that they like to have a joke and a smoke, and speaking of which, I'm going to address it now. Remember I told you that there have been a lot of judgments surrounding this case and Becky? Well, that's one thing that's mentioned: smoking pot, weed, marijuana, whatever you want to call it. Yes, Becky liked smoking. It wasn't a habit as much as a necessity for Becky because, in the medical field, it is used for medicinal purposes, and I'm sure she had somewhat of an understanding of the benefits compared to things like prescription pain meds. Even though I know that back then it was still illegal, I was actually surprised that it only recently became legal in 2021, on March 31st, in New York. Becky had injured her back so much so that she had to undergo back surgery, not only leaving her with scars on her lower back, but also with a dependency on oxycodone. She did not want that becoming more of a problem than a solution to her ongoing pain, so she turned to marijuana for help. It was a much safer alternative to oxycodone, without such addicting properties. I don't pass judgment on individuals that I don't know personally and their choices. Instead, I rely on those closest to the person, their descriptions, and their perceptions. Those are the ones I count on to understand who someone like Becky was. She wasn't a reckless drug addict, for example, but she dabbled. She was actually very responsible. She held down jobs and had just transitioned from working in the hospital as a nursing assistant to a home health aide. Becky was determined to find a job where she could make more of a difference in someone's life. She helped the elderly and autistic individuals, as well as people described by her mom as having developmental disabilities. She wanted to help others live their best lives. That was very fulfilling to her, and she would treat them like they were her own family. She was very dedicated. For example, in 2009, her current position was as a part-time in-home caregiver for a developmentally disabled 16-year-old who struggled with everyday tasks. Becky would get up bright and early in the morning, before 6 a.m., so that she could arrive at this boy's house with enough time to help ensure he was prepared for school. She would help him get dressed, feed him breakfast, then get him on the bus and off the bus after school was over every day. She truly loved him, but as fulfilling as it was, her job also came with difficulties. So after work, she liked to let loose, like many of us do. Everyone needs something to escape. Becky loved music, friends, and going out. Years ago, Nicole had introduced her to a friend named Jason, who ended up becoming Nicole's brother-in-law years later. Jason merged into their very close friend group and became a best friend of Becky's. He remembers the impression Becky left on him when they were introduced. He didn't know that such a genuine person like her existed. She had the biggest smile, he said. It would reach past her ears. Well, Jason ended up getting a roommate named Dan Mayer, who was 28 years old. In the fall of 2009, Dan started to accompany Jason when all of them went out, and eventually Dan met Becky. He was infatuated right away. Everyone could tell he really liked her. Soon, by October of that year, they were getting to know each other and hanging out more and more. He would pick her up from work, then they would go grab a drink or a bite to eat, go to a movie, or just hang out with friends back at Jason's place. Soon, Becky confided in her mom that she and Dan were a thing, but it wasn't very serious. They were just starting to get to know one another. Fast forward to December of the same year, so just a couple of months later. It's Thursday, December 3rd. Becky's mom worked the night shift at the hospital the night before, from 7:45 p.m. until 8:15 in the morning, and she had another night shift that night. So she slept in until about 2:30 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Barbara did her normal everyday routine, and later in the evening, when she was making dinner and getting ready for work, Becky and Dan were laughing and joking around as Becky was hovering over her brother, trying to steal some of his French fries. Well, Barbara said to Becky, "What are your plans for tonight?" Becky told her that she and Nicole were going down to Kelly's Ale House for some drinks, and then they were going to meet up with Dan and some friends. She said she should be home later because she had to work early the next morning, so she needed to be at work at 6. And Barbara was like, "Okay, just text me when you get home." Becky said she would, like she always did. Becky knew that Barbara worried about her. Even though she was 24, she kept in constant contact with her mother throughout the day. Whenever she ventured out to a bar or went anywhere in town with a friend, she texted her mom to let her know she arrived home safely. No matter what she was doing, Becky made sure that she was always in communication with someone, whether it was a call, a text, or a MySpace message. She always had her phone on her. It was basically glued to her, so it was easy for her to answer right away, and she would. That night, Barbara was very busy with her rounds at the hospital, but around 3:30 in the morning, she was on break and had time to check her phone. She saw a text come in from Becky at the same time that said she was home and going to bed, and that she loved her. Barbara responded, "Well, sleep well. You have to be at work in a couple of hours." She said, "I love you." Nothing out of the ordinary. But a few hours later, Becky's stepdad Larry was at home getting ready for work that morning, and he got a call around 6 a.m. It was from Becky's boss. Apparently, Becky had not shown up at her patient's house at her normal time, and they wanted to know if she overslept and was coming in. Larry was already rushing. He could hear her alarm going off at 6:20 in the morning. As he was leaving, he checked the driveway and saw Becky's car still outside. He called her name, thinking that she would hear him and get up. Barbara was still at work for another couple of hours, and Larry had to rush to work. He would be there all day. So he quickly texted Barbara to let her know what was going on. The text read, "Becky's boss called the house. She didn't show up for work. I'm late for work and racing out the door. Will you call her?" When Barbara saw this message, her first feeling was of anger. She told Becky that she better get some sleep because she had to work early in the morning. It wasn't like Becky to just not show up like this. The family that hired Becky counted on her. So Barbara was very disappointed. She immediately called Becky, and it rang and rang 6 times, and then it went to voicemail. Barbara wasn't happy. Becky always answered her calls. So when she heard that voicemail kick in, she went off. It was a pretty heated message, and in no uncertain terms, she let her know that her job was her responsibility and that she needed to get to work now. Barbara expected to hear back from Becky pretty quickly, as it was typical for her to respond back right away, especially when it was her mother. But after about 10 or 15 minutes, and not getting a call or even a text back acknowledging that Becky got her message, Barbara called Becky again. This time her phone seemed to be turned off, or she was purposely ignoring Barbara's call because it went straight to voicemail. Now, some people may not be alarmed, but Barbara was. She knew right away something wasn't right. She told herself, "This is not the way that Becky operates, something's off." So she went back to texting, thinking that maybe Becky did go to work and now she was busy, so maybe she couldn't call her back. It was still unlike Becky, and she was trying to come up with reasonable explanations for her not reaching back out. She was saying things like, "Hello? Did you get my text? Did you get my call? Where are you? Get up. Wake up. Why aren't you answering?" They were getting a little more aggressive over time. Over the next hour and a half or so, Barbara sent a number of messages. At some point, she was even kind of yelling at Becky, reprimanding her for not being responsible. Barbara and Becky's former co-workers from the hospital knew that she never missed one day of work, and even if she was running late, she would let someone know. She cared so much about her patients. She would never just leave them hanging like that. At 8:15 in the morning, that Friday, December 4th, Barbara was finally leaving work. At this point, Becky would have been 2 hours late for her job, and still, there was no word from her. So Barbara was trying to get back to the house as fast as she could so that she could wake up her daughter and hopefully salvage her job. As she was driving, she was filled with mixed emotions. She had worked all night, she was worried, she was disappointed, but she was also scared. When she pulled up in that driveway and saw Becky's car, her emotions went straight back to anger. She figured, you know what? Becky partied too hard the night before. Her phone died, she overslept, and she was racing inside on a mission at this point, definitely upset. She ran right into Becky's room, opened the door, and she wasn't inside. So Barbara was trying to figure out what was going on. She saw Becky's purse in her room. She didn't leave her purse. Most of us know that our purse contains our lives. We don't go far without it. So Barbara was worried. She didn't see Becky's phone, and she was nowhere in the house. She knew that Becky was supposed to be with Nicole the night before, so she called Nicole, letting her know her daughter didn't show up for work and she wanted to know if Nicole knew what was going on. Nicole said no, she had no idea where Becky would be because she went home earlier than Becky. The last she saw her was at Kelly's ale house around 1:30 in the morning, and Nicole was heading out. Becky wasn't ready to leave. She told her she was going to get a ride from Dan, who had met up with them with friends. Nicole tells Barbara to maybe call Dan and check with him. Maybe she crashed over there the night before and her phone died. Barbara doesn't really know Dan that well, but she decides to check with him anyway to see if there's some reason that he decided not to drive Becky back home, and maybe she was still over there with him. So she calls him. Dan's like, "Becky's not at my place." He says, "I dropped her off at home around 3:15, 3:30, and he said he even made sure to walk her inside, up to the door and everything." Barbara feels like Dan may be trying to cover for Becky, maybe because of how angry Barbara had been and those messages that she left in the text messages. So she says, "Dan, please don't lie to me. I'm not mad at her. I just want to make sure she's okay." But Dan swears Becky is not at his place. So Barbara goes into panic mode. Nicole, Becky's best friend, and Dan, her new boyfriend, two people that should be the closest to her, especially the night before when they were all hanging out, are unaware of her whereabouts. So Barbara goes into panic mode. Nicole, Becky's best friend, and Dan, her new boyfriend, two people that should be the closest to her, especially the night before when they were all hanging out, are unaware of her whereabouts. Barbara tells Larry maybe to call Nicole and Dan himself to see if he could get a different response. You know, maybe hearing from the dad being more stern or something, they would tell him. Meanwhile, Barbara is calling everyone else she knows her daughter is close with. Co-workers, friends, family, her cousins, everyone. It's not long before all of Becky's close friends are made aware of the situation, and none of them have any information about where she could be. It's concerning to them. They know how much respect Becky has for her mother. She would never leave her like this without telling her where she was. And of course, they're trying to come up with the most logical scenarios. Like, okay, maybe her phone died. She has no way to call them back and let them know where she's at. But why was her car at home? How would she have gotten around? Dan was the one that said he dropped her off at 3:30. That's around the time she texted her mom to let her know she was at home. So, Larry calls Barbara back and says, "You know what? Nicole and Dan both say that they don't know where she is. They were together at Kelly's house, then Nicole left around 1:30, and then the other group of friends went to Butcher Boys. It's a bar and grill, and they went there for the rest of the night. Then Dan took Becky and two other girls home, dropping Becky off first around 3:30 in the morning. He walked her to her door and left. Neither one of them has heard from Becky or seen her since then." Well, at this point, Barbara wants to see for herself, so she gets Dan's address, and she takes a drive over there, hoping that Dan is, like I said, covering for Becky, and that she just scared that Barbara is really upset. She's hiding out until it blows over. Remember that this is also the house of Becky's close friend, Jason. He lives with Dan. Barbara shows up and again asks Dan if Becky was inside, because she's desperate for answers, and he's adamant. He tells her, "No, Becky's not at my place." She begged Dan to please let her know if he hears anything from her daughter. She's exhausted, she's feeling defeated. She's been working for hours and would usually go to sleep at this point, but she can't sleep. She can't think. She just keeps calling and texting Becky. She would text things like, "Becky, please call home. We're so worried about you. I love you so much. Please call home immediately. Are you okay? Do you need us to come get you?" Everyone's concerned. They are constantly checking in with Barbara, who is now waiting for Larry to get off work so that he can help her figure out what is going on. Hours go by, and at this point, Becky's friends are trying to call people, check social media, trying to see if they could locate Becky, and still nothing. Several of Becky's friends, Nicole, Lindsay, her uncle Ked, and many others made their way over to Barbara's, just sitting in the living room with their phones and their laptops, trying to do whatever they could to help. Barbara called out of work that night. She couldn't function. She had to find her daughter. She was so tired, but she was keeping herself awake. She would only fall asleep when she was so exhausted that she couldn't fight it anymore. By the time Larry was off work that evening and gets back home, it's around 7:30 p.m. And Becky's friends had now camped out on her parents' living room floor. They had blankets and food, and they had managed to log into some type of phone location app on their computer. It had the capability to provide a general vicinity of where Becky's phone was, as long as it was on and within an area of the cell tower, so you could ping it, so to speak, and get the location. I don't think it was Find My iPhone. I don't think it existed back then, but it was something similar, and they were just waiting and waiting to see if it would light up so they could drive to that location that it pinged from. It is an ice-cold winter in Long Island in December. The weather's brutal. The temperatures drop down to like the 20s, and that's -5 Celsius. It's snowy, it's icy, it's just unbearable to be outside for an extended period of time. And Barbara is really starting to think about that. She doesn't want to imagine her daughter out there in the cold, all alone somewhere. Larry decides it's time to call the local police department in Suffolk County to notify them about Becky's disappearance. He explained that she would never remain out of touch this long. She never had. It wasn't like her. She wouldn't just leave her loved ones worried like this. She also didn't do things like drink excessively either, and anytime she wasn't feeling well, she would let you know. Even if she did miss work on purpose, she would be up by now doing things, running errands, eating, being in her room, talking to her friends, going on social media, something. It had been all day with no word and no activity. No one close to her had heard anything. Something wasn't right. It had been 16 hours since she was last seen. They sent an officer out to Larry and Barbara's house to take a report. They asked them the basics about Rebecca, who she was, her age, when she was seen last, and with whom. They tell them everything that I've already told you, but of course in a lot more detail. Barbara says Becky has never disappeared like this before, and Larry adds that there isn't a day that goes by that she wouldn't call. Even if she had a disagreement, she would call her friends. That phone was stuck to her ear. She wouldn't leave her purse behind like that either. So what was the urgency? Even her wallet and ID were still there, and that's when her parents explained that Dan, who was Becky's new boyfriend, was the one that was last seen with her. They didn't know him very well. He seemed nice enough, but it wasn't a very serious relationship. Becky had confided in her mom that they had their little issues here and there. And as they are in the middle of this conversation, guess who shows up? Dan. He's there to help. He's wanting to look for Becky, track her down, and he seems concerned, but also angry. As everyone's providing information, Dan starts to question Barbara about whether Becky had another man in her life. She's like, "Really? That's your concern right now?" She said, "No, she doesn't." Dan responded by saying, "Are you sure?" And she was like, "Wow, yes, I'm sure. And this is really not the time to be self-centered, accusing her of doing something with someone else because we can't even find her." Barbara did not like the way that Dan was coming off. She thought it was odd. Then, in the middle of them trying to locate her daughter, he's worried about her cheating on him. But maybe it was because he was trying to think of alternative places she could be. Dan's behavior raises suspicions with Barbara. After the report was put in, there wasn't much else for them to do but wait. And it was really hard on Barbara. Fear was setting in. She was breaking down in tears. She just wanted to hear Becky's voice again. She wanted to see her face to know she was okay, and she was constantly texting her, "Please, please call me." I was shocked to find out that over 200,000 women go missing every year in Suffolk County in Long Island. That's so many. And 19 hours had gone by. It's close to 9 p.m., and the group is still trying to ping her phone every 15 minutes. Larry is doing it so that they can contact her. Larry also calls the officer back from Suffolk County PD and provides him with the login information to access Becky's cell phone. They have a family plan, so they're able to get in and see her call log. He also explains that they're keeping tabs on her location through a phone locator app and will update the police with any new information. And sure enough, they see her phone. It is actually moving, and it's an exhilarating feeling, because in that moment it had just come up for a minute, and then it would be gone, and it would come up, and then it would be gone. It wasn't steadily tracking her location. It was like disappearing, as if the phone was being turned on and off and on and off. They were trying not to even blink so they could pinpoint where it was, and they were just sitting there, diligently, making notes of every location that it would flash at. They were hoping that the police could use this information to narrow down a search or to tell other police departments to be on the lookout in that area. There was nothing concrete because the app would light up in an area, but it wouldn't stay lit up for long, so they weren't confident that Becky would still be there. Even though this app gives a radius of about 1 mile from where the pinpointed ping is, around 2 o'clock in the morning, they do get a strong signal though. The app is showing that Becky is about 12 miles west, and it is steadily blinking, not moving. It's about a 20-minute drive, but it's close enough to where they decide to all get in their vehicles and race over there. Her friends are trying to think of anyone they know in that area. Why would Becky be there? They had no idea. But along the way, they're screaming her name out the windows. They're again scanning the streets, keeping their eyes open for any signs of her. They get closer to the area where her phone pinged, and they're driving slower, looking around, and they realize it's an industrial area. There aren't a lot of houses. It's in the middle of the night, so nothing's open, and they're confused. But they get out and they look around. They even knock on businesses' doors. They're desperate to find out if anyone knows where Becky is, and there was no one. They had no choice but to go back to Larry and Barbara's house and wait. The next morning, it's Saturday, December 6th. The group decided to create missing persons flyers. They go have a bunch of them printed, hundreds, so they could go door to door, starting in Becky's neighborhood and then expanding outward everywhere, just so they could ask people if they had seen her. They were taping these flyers up everywhere. They lived in a pretty tight-knit community. Becky had grown up there. So many people came together to help find her. Here's what the flyers looked like. It says, "Have you seen Becky?" It has her name on it. Rebecca Koster answers to Becky. She's 24, 5 feet 5 inches tall, 112 pounds. Her birthday is June 12th, 1985. She has dark brown eyes and dark brown straight hair to the middle of her back, and she'd been missing since 3:30 in the morning on December 4th. As far as clothing that she had been wearing the last time anyone saw her, she had on a black puffy Rocawear brand zip-up jacket with pink lining, black boots with gray fur on them, and light blue jeans. They also list identifying characteristics. She had butterfly tattoos. One was a large lower back tattoo where she had that surgical scar from her back injury, and the other tattoo was a smaller one on the right outer side of her ankle. She had her acrylic nails done with a French manicure and designs on both of the ring fingers and a tiny nose ring stud in the right side of her nose. She also had a cartilage ear piercing that had a bar that goes to the top. You can see it right here. Oh, and she had her tongue pierced. Everyone went all over in different areas and passed these flyers out. Larry passed out at least 180 flyers. He was showing Becky's picture to as many people as he could. They went door to door in the neighborhood, and no one had any clues for them. Barbara started to lean more and more into thinking that Dan may know more than he's saying. Barbara didn't want to say anything about it yet, but she was beginning to ask all of Becky's friends what they thought about him. Jason, his roommate, knew him very well, and he said, "You know what? Dan loves Becky. They seem happy together. They have a great relationship as far as he can tell." He didn't think anything could have happened between Dan and Becky that would cause her to go missing. He'd never seen Dan give off any clues that he would hurt Becky. But they know that people can snap. Sometimes the least likely person is responsible. But as more friends gave their opinions, it was revealed that Dan was definitely a lot more interested in Becky than she was in him. So they started to wonder if something happened at the bar to cause him to be jealous, and then that led to something worse, something that put Becky in danger. This is all they had to go on. Everyone else checked out. He was the new guy. Friends were really coming down on him. They were asking him a bunch of questions and not really accepting his answers, even though he hadn't changed his story from the first time that Barbara reached out. I don't blame them for being laser-focused on Dan. He was the last known person to have admitted seeing her. But there were 2 other witnesses in his car, And even Dan's sister told them Dan dropped Becky off and they haven't seen her since. At this point, he's getting frustrated by all the attention being put on him. Larry even went to his door. He's asking what happened to Becky, saying things like, "We think you know more than you're saying," and he just broke down. He started to cry. He said, "I love Becky, and I would never do anything to hurt her." He felt attacked, but he was still helping the search. He, Jason, and some of their other friends went out to Butcher Boys, that bar and grill where they were all hanging out before Dan took Becky home. They spoke to the bartenders and the managers and even patrons that were there, and no one knew anything or had any information about Becky. By now, Barbara had relayed her suspicions about Dan to everyone helping them search. She thought that he might have Becky hidden somewhere. There were people involved in this search that were like armchair detectives, but more like neighborhood watch, because they were keeping track of Dan's every move. There were people parked on his street, basically doing their own surveillance on him. Well, this didn't go over well with Dan. He was not okay with being accused of harming Becky or lying about where she was. He felt like everyone was against him, and despite this, his own roommate, Jason, felt certain Dan was not responsible. However, Becky's family didn't see it that way. They felt Dan had more information, and he wasn't letting on to it since he was the last person to have seen her. They let police know what they believe. He has something to do with her disappearance. The police always tried to build out a timeline, starting in the days leading up to a person's disappearance. They need him. They need every detail he knows because many times the last person to see someone is the person who made them disappear. Well, they are about to get an even bigger reason to look into Dan. Barbara can't sleep. It feels like the hours are going by so slowly. All the thoughts that are going through her mind. It's been over 24 hours since her daughter has been seen. All she wanted to do was make sure she was safe. But the night seemed to stretch on endlessly. The next day, on Sunday, December 6th, Barbara goes to find comfort at the home of her sister Elaine's house. They tried to have a normal visit. They were wrapping presents together and talking about what could have happened to Becky. They even had some friends go to a psychic who told them, "You know what? Becky's fine. She's going to come home. She's alive, but she's in a dark place. Don't worry, they're going to find her." It was hard not to think about the possibility that Becky wasn't just missing, but that something worse had happened to her. Barbara was having a very hard time not breaking down. She stayed over Elaine's into the later end of the night, and at 11:40, she looks at her phone screen when it lights up, and she is shocked. She just received a message from Becky. There are so many emotions rushing through her. What it said was very concerning. The text read, "Mom, Dan has me tied up in the basement. He doesn't know I have my phone. I'm not sure where I'm at. Please help." Barbara doesn't hesitate. She calls Becky right back, and she doesn't answer. So she's sending a text to Becky saying, "Call 911, they will find you." Barbara was frantic. She didn't know what to do, but at least there was hope running through her. She was mixed with fear and confusion and the feeling of, "I knew it." Her beliefs were confirmed. Dan had her daughter, and she was in danger. She couldn't help but feel overwhelmed, knowing that the first person Becky reached out to was her mom. She knows that when a child is in need, they usually call out to their mother, but at the same time, she wished she had just taken that moment to call 911, and maybe she had, but not knowing was driving Barbara crazy. Filled with adrenaline, she calls the officers on her daughter's case and lets them know what happened, that Becky is being held captive by Dan May. She alerts everyone that's helping them with the search, and they're like, "Oh my God, she's alive. We've got to find her." And they're on a rescue mission. Barbara races back home, and she and Larry jump back on the computer with all of Becky's friends standing right next to them, and they ping her phone on that locator app, but it won't stay active long enough to register a location. So they say, "Forget it. Let's just race over to Dan's." That's where the cops were headed. I mean, obviously, she said Dan was the one holding her hostage. It makes sense. They waste no time, and they get over there. They need to hurry. They know he's got their daughter, and they don't want to tip him off because that might risk him taking her somewhere else or worse. Before Barbara, Larry, and her concerned friends and family get to Dan's house, the cops are already there. They're inside questioning him. The police came ready. They weren't taking any chances due to the nature of Becky's text messages. They also had probable cause to do a full search of those premises, and that's what they do. Every room was thoroughly searched. Unfortunately, it turned up nothing, and Becky's family had trouble accepting this fact. To further investigate, the detectives knocked on every door in that vicinity, all around the neighborhood, to see if they could find any evidence of Becky's whereabouts. But they found nothing. No one had heard or seen anything. Jason is sitting there perplexed as to why they would send people, the cops, over to his place. He lives with Dan, and he's a close friend of Becky's. He's frustrated, saying, "If she was in my house, I would know. She's not here, she hasn't been here." He's like, "Wow, I could have told you that she wasn't here. If she was tied up, I'd know. There's no way, no way." Almost like this was unnecessary, but everyone looks suspicious at this point when they don't have any leads. The officers bring Dan down to the station, and since this case has escalated into more of an endangered persons investigation, Philip Frendo from Suffolk County, a detective, is assisting. He sits down with Dan to ask him everything he knows about Becky. Dan's demeanor at this point is a mixture of frustration, confusion, anger, and concern. He explains he met up with Nicole, Becky, and a group of their friends at Kelly's Ale House. At some point, Nicole goes home. Everyone moves from Kelly's Ale House to Butcher Boy's, and then they hung out, drank, and played pool. Everything was normal. When closing time came, Becky, along with 2 other women, got into Dan's car, and he dropped Becky off first around 3:30. He says those women can corroborate everything I'm telling you, and he tells Frendo, "I did nothing wrong. I love her. I would never hurt Becky." Then they ask, "Was she intoxicated when you dropped her off?" And he's like, "Well, yeah, I mean, she'd been drinking. She was a little wobbly. I had to hold her up when I was bringing her to the door, but it's not like she couldn't get in her own door and unlock it and go inside. She wasn't falling down drunk." And they're like, "Are you sure she made it inside?" And he's like, "Yes. I watched her go inside and close the door behind her." Dan is cooperative. Detective Frendo asks him if he's willing to take a polygraph just so that they can clear his name. Most of you know polygraph results are not admissible in court. They are a detection device. They use them to probe for information, maybe if someone's hiding something, and using this, they can press them even further. Dan agrees to take the polygraph, and they focus it on whether Dan had any knowledge of Becky's disappearance or her whereabouts. Well, it turns out the result shows deception. Even though they're not reliable, this result keeps Dan under the microscope. They sat there interviewing him for another couple of hours, but they did reach out, and they were able to confirm with those 2 other women that Dan drove her home, and they saw Becky go into that house. Jason could corroborate that fact as well, that Becky had not been at their place, and Dan has an alibi for when Becky went missing and for when those texts were sent. He wasn't in a basement holding Becky captive, so Dan is cleared for now. But that doesn't mean much when it comes to Becky's family and friends. Jamie knew that Becky wouldn't lie about being tied up, and she would know if it was Dan, unless, I don't know, he had her blindfolded or something, or maybe someone was trying to make it look like they were Dan. Even if the police couldn't prove Dan did something to Becky, there was no way she would lie to her mother. Something wasn't right. People wanted Dan arrested. He was having a nervous breakdown, pleading to Jason, "What do I do to make people believe I didn't do anything wrong?" Meanwhile, detectives are interviewing Nicole, Cole, and all of Becky's other friends that were with her on December 3rd into the early morning hours of December 4th. They're building out their timeline. Nicole lets them know that the night actually started at Becky's house. They had bought some weed earlier that day, and she explained that Becky had a back injury and relied on smoking weed every day to deal with ongoing pain. That night, they were in Becky's garage, smoking and drinking. Then they headed out to Kelly's Ale House, and Nicole, like everyone has already said, goes home around 1:30 in the morning. Nicole says Becky came outside, she grabbed a cigarette and her jacket out of my car, and I have not seen her since. Well, that's more information than they had before. It doesn't really add much help to their search, but every piece of this timeline is important. Worries about Becky's disappearance spread quickly. The local news stations were all over this case now. They were going live from all the different locations Becky had been seen last, as well as gathering right in front of Dan's house and Barbara and Larry's house, asking the public for help and to contact the authorities with any information they may have. Her family hoped that the coverage from the media would bring in new leads. Her loved ones even spoke to multiple reporters, sharing their stories and hoping that this information would lead to Becky being found. They were pleading for help, and they were praying for Becky's safe return. Barbara just clung to her phone. She refused to put it down. She was hoping Becky would text her again. It was her lifeline to her daughter. It's all she had to hold on to. She was desperate for even the tiniest bit of hope that they would find her. She said that every time she heard that text tone from her phone, it was like her heart would stop. She was just clinging to it, watching and waiting. Then around 3 hours after that first text from Becky came in, she managed to text her mom again. Wow, can you even imagine? Barbara can hardly handle it, and this text is worse. It read, "My phone is about to die and my mouth is taped. I can't talk. I think this is Comac. Don't tell Dan about my text, or he will kill me." Comac is a part of town. It's not where Dan's house is located. It's about 30 minutes west of Becky's. Barbara is beside herself. Becky just texted that her life is in danger. She is in immediate harm, and they don't know how to find her. Barbara alerts the detectives, and then she and all of her family and Becky's friends head over to Comac to search for her. They did what they had done before in other locations. They drove up and down the streets, just yelling her name. They had no idea where in Comac Becky would be. They were knocking on people's doors, screaming her name, just in case she heard them and could alert them to where she was being held. This is intense, but again the search was in vain. There's no sign of her, so they have to go home and wait. They are back on the computer, and wouldn't you know it? Becky's phone is pinging again. This time it's off Northern State Parkway. It's on the other side of the island. But they don't care. They don't care how far they have to drive. They're gonna find Becky. This is all too much. They don't have the resources that the detectives do, and they're giving them all this information. Every single time a new location pings, the cops go out there and look. However, this time it was a little more precise. It was a florist. But that didn't make any sense. It was closed. It was so late at night. No one wants to be negative about Becky's text because it's all they have to hold on to. But they do begin to question things like, if she was tied up, how was she even getting to her phone to text? Her friends are trying to make sense of it. Could it be in her back pocket, and then her hands are tied together behind her, and she's able to kind of slip it out and then look behind her, kind of turn her head back and text? They don't know, but they're trying to stay positive. Some people like Jason and Jamie question whether it was really Becky texting her mom or if it was someone else. Why wouldn't she call 911? She's an intelligent, street-smart woman. Why waste your time texting your mom at all? Just go get help. But they don't know the circumstances. Maybe she didn't have really good service, maybe it was spotty, and only text could go through, and she knew her family would contact the police. I would be thinking all of those same things, just running scenarios in my head. Becky's family was becoming increasingly concerned as the days went by without her being located. At Dan's house, and still getting texts implicating him, they told detectives what they thought, that the messages didn't sound like Becky. The perfect spelling was suspicious. Like, if you were distressed, would you add correct punctuation? No, it wasn't adding up. There were definitely red flags going up, and though Dan had been cleared, he wasn't making it easy on himself. After all the accusations, another text saying that he's holding her hostage because he does something very alarming. He goes on Facebook and changes his name to Dan the Killer. Why would he do that? Well, his friends assumed it's because he's lashing out. He's fed up, he's being accused of being a killer. Jason is insisting someone's playing a trick on them, and they don't understand why they would want to frame Dan for this. Becky wouldn't do this. Detectives decide to pay a visit to Butcher Boy's Bar and Grill, where she was last seen right before she disappeared. They were eager to examine any CCTV footage that might be available before it's too late. They were hoping it would lead them in the right direction. Would it show Becky and Dan getting into an argument? Was there anything suspicious going on regarding staff or other patrons that interacted with Becky? Well, the footage shows different areas of the place. Here is the actual footage. You can see the back of the restaurant, the pool table, the bar area. Detectives saw Becky and Dan and her friends, and also several men approaching Becky throughout the night. The detectives wonder if one of them may have something to do with her disappearance. Nicole had mentioned that Becky was very trusting to a fault, and because she was so beautiful, she received a lot of unwanted attention. But she didn't want to hurt anyone's feelings. She would try to be nice even when guys were being pushy. Detectives noticed that any time Dan would leave Becky's side, men would walk right up to her and start talking. She would chat for a minute and then turn away and talk to her friends again, or Dan would walk back up. This went on all night. I mean, sure, that's not uncommon. It's a public place, especially a bar, lots of singles. They're there to meet people, and Becky is gorgeous. She's not married, she's not wearing a ring, guys would hit on her. How would they know she was taken until, of course, they spoke to her? Her friends were familiar with this song and dance. Becky would smile, she would be pleasant, she would tell them, "I have a boyfriend," and then they would go back to just enjoying their night. Detectives show this footage to Barbara and Larry. At one point, Becky is captured on the security video standing by a jukebox at 3:20 in the morning, with Dan beside her. Larry said that Becky looked like she wanted to get out of that bar. You could see her body language, and it looked as though she kept saying, "I want to go home." Larry's like, "You can see her. She's sitting there waiting to get out of there," while Dan and his friends are on the other side of the bar just still hanging out. While this investigation into Becky's disappearance continued, the detectives started to try to identify these men that were seen on the bar CCTV footage. They do realize it was late. Becky had to work, and that's probably why she wanted to leave. But they also want to know if there was any other reason for her urgency about leaving. Did someone make her feel uncomfortable? Well, the CCTV footage, like so many other times, is grainy. They can't make out who these people are, so they're doing their best to work with the staff on getting receipts and other information that can lead them to the people who spoke to Becky that night. Detectives also ask her friends if anyone stood out to them, any men they encountered or that they saw Becky with. They say yeah. One guy followed Becky to the bar when she went to go grab a drink by herself, and they saw her sitting there with him and talking for a little while. Detectives show her friends the footage, and they point the guy out. You can see him sitting right here, right next to Becky, while she's waiting on her drink. The man appeared to be African American, well-dressed, well-groomed, and it seemed as though Becky and the man were just engaged in a normal conversation. But upon closer inspection, they see the light of a phone screen light up. It looked like Becky and this guy had exchanged numbers, either that, or Becky had let him use her phone, because it looked like her phone passed between hers and his hands. They watch it again and again. It's really bad quality. They can't really be sure exactly what was happening, but they want to see if they can identify this patron. Furthermore, they want to take a look at Becky's phone records, so they request that information from her carrier and ask it to be rushed. This is about to take the investigation into a whole different direction. Meanwhile, over at Becky's, the investigation continued. Technicians were inside. They were now taking DNA samples from Becky's family, hair samples from brushes, and collecting things like her toothbrushes, among other things like dental records. They would need those and Becky's DNA to compare it with evidence they find, including a body, should they locate one that matches Becky's description. This news filled her family with dread, because it was starting to look like this investigator was pointing more and more towards a murder rather than a missing persons case. With every passing day, they felt their hope of finding Becky alive slipping away. Barbara wasn't getting any more text messages from her, so they were hoping that her phone records would reveal a clue. Investigators discovered that there was a series of phone calls and texts to and from Becky's phone that occurred after she returned home from the bar. This finding was particularly concerning because it suggested that Becky may have been in contact with someone once Dan witnessed her getting inside her house safely. He could be telling the truth, and it wasn't him who spoke to her last after all. This new evidence prompted detectives to look even deeper. They saw that Becky called a number around 3:30 in the morning, which is around the time that she was dropped off. Detectives tracked down who the number belonged to, and it was a friend of hers, Anthony Castro. He had already been interviewed, and he was cooperating with the investigation to try to find her. He told detectives that she called him asking to meet up for a bit after she came home from the bar that night, but he declined. He has been ruled out as a suspect. Then, they moved to the next number on her phone records. The next 3 calls were from a different number, one with a 617 area code, which is from the Boston area. The first call came in around 4 a.m. and Becky didn't pick up. Then another call came in at 4:10 a.m. and then another at 4:27 a.m. They provided this number to Becky's family, and no one knew who it was. Her friends didn't have anyone in that area code in their phones, and they didn't know anyone that Becky would know out in Boston. Investigators called the number, and no one picked up, so they attempted to request phone records for this number. However, they were informed that it was associated with a prepaid cell phone, and unfortunately, due to the nature of that type of phone, it's harder for investigators to track down the owner's information. In order to obtain more in-depth information, the police actually had to get a court order. It's hard for police to track burner phones, just like in the Long Island serial killer case that's going on right now. He is said to have used a burner phone or prepaid phone without real service, so he could stay anonymous and just throw it away after he was done with it. This is how investigators in the case of Rex Huerman believe he was speaking with those sex workers that he is accused of possibly killing. But of course, we know people don't just use prepaid cell phones when they're criminals. I know I've had one before because I didn't have any credit to get a real phone, like an AT&T and whatnot. So, it's definitely an option, especially for someone who might be younger. They may opt to go with a prepaid phone until they learn to become more responsible. Well, after receiving the court-ordered information, they were able to get a hold of cell tower records to see where this phone was pinging, but they could not locate any personal information about its owner. Anyone can buy them at local gas stations, convenience stores, or Walmart. They also obtained all of Becky's cell tower information, and now they know that she was indeed at her house on Falcon Avenue at 3:30 in the morning, like Dan had said. She was still at that location when the calls from the Boston number came in. The location of the unknown caller was west of Becky's house. The first call lasted for 15 minutes, and while on this call, the pings from the unknown caller's phone were heading east towards where Becky was. The next call came in at 4:27 in the morning, and that call was only 20 seconds long. When they mapped the cell tower pings from both Becky's and the unknown caller's phones, they were in the exact same place, Becky's house. Logically, investigators believed that whoever this was called Becky to see if she wanted to hang out. Police already knew that she was looking to do something after returning home because her friend Anthony provided information about the content of the call she made to him at 3:30. So it stands to reason that the second call that came in right outside of Becky's was the unknown caller letting her know they had arrived. That's why it's only 20 seconds. That's how long it would take to say "I'm here" and for Becky to respond. Not too long after this, both phones were traveling in the same direction, headed to an area to the north called Port Jefferson Station, which is about 15 minutes away. Soon afterward, there's no activity coming from Becky's phone, except of course, later when her family tries to obtain those pings on the computer. Cell phone tower pings are not precise. They give you a vicinity of where the person was located, so they had a lot of investigating to do at this point. However, they were further along than they had been. Everyone was wondering who this person was that Becky left with so late or so early in the morning when she had to be up for work at 6 a.m. Clearly, they had to be the link to knowing what happened to her. So who were they? Well, once again, the investigation was going to take another turn, and it wasn't a good one. Devastating, actually. On Tuesday, December 8th, 4 days after Becky went missing, a nationwide alert was put out with all the pertinent information. Now even more media outlets were all over this case. A beautiful young girl goes missing after a night out, texting her mom that she's tied up. Of course, it drew interest. The media was basically living on Barbara's front lawn, just waiting for the news to break, and it was about to. At the same time that all of this was happening in New York, there was another case gaining media attention 100 miles away in another state. It was a place called Stonington, Connecticut, about 3 hours away from Becky's, and it's very rural. There are only about 5,000 people living in that area, maybe less. Interestingly, it's on what is referred to as Long Island Sound, which is that body of water between Long Island and Connecticut. I've heard of it before, but I never knew where it was or anything like how it was formed. See how it's a cutout? Well, that's because it was created when a glacier tore a hole in that land. We're talking 10,000 to 15,000 years ago, but I found that fact to be worth mentioning. Unlike Long Island, though, Stonington is not built up. It has a lot of undeveloped land and a lot of farms. You can see what it looks like on this map. Just a lot of nothing. Well, there was something. Back on Friday, December 4th, around 7:15 p.m., less than 24 hours after Becky went missing, a man named Russell Morrison was driving towards his home down a dark, winding country road called Jeremy Hill in North Stony, Connecticut. He was coming up to Route 2011, which is also known as Mystic Road. This area is definitely the back roads. It's quiet, dark, and sleepy. He saw something up ahead. It was on the left side of the road, and it was really bright. It appeared to be a small brush fire. So he immediately called 911, and as he got closer, he pulled over. Now, coincidentally, he just happened to be an assistant fire chief. The fire department was only 3 minutes away from this location, so Russell pulled over, relaying all this information, including his exact location, to the 911 operator. They alerted the fire department, and they were out there within minutes. As a matter of fact, by the time Russell was able to pull out his fire extinguisher from his truck, the fire department was already there. The fire wasn't raging. It actually looked like it had just been set minutes before Russell saw it. They didn't have to use a fire hose. The chief was on the scene, and he took a fire extinguisher and tried to combat the flames as they were getting smaller and smaller. He realized that there appeared to be a body on fire. Now I know in many cases I hear it's never a mannequin, and I'm starting to think we need another saying, it's never a brush fire. Because of the chief's belief that it's a body, he began aiming the fire extinguisher upward instead of directly on the area. He did this to keep the chemicals from coming down aggressively. This was to preserve the evidence, and once the fire was out, they realized it was not just a fire, it was a human body on fire. State troopers were immediately notified because this finding indicated that this was a crime scene. How many times is this now that I've unknowingly started researching a case only to find out it consists of finding a body burning on the side of a road? It's understandable. This is a common way for someone to dispose of a body because fires are unforgiving. They destroy everything in their path. I can think of at least 3 recent cases involving fires. Celia Huda, the Florida Gator cheerleader, Andrea DeVasco, the college sorority girl, and the Friendly family. It's unreal, and it never gets easier to talk about these cases. Connecticut state troopers came out there. They blocked off the road, designated it as a crime scene, put up the yellow tape, and began searching for any evidence that they could find. It's for sure the remains of a human body, and as they're taking a closer look, documenting every detail of what they're seeing as soon as they get there, so they can have the most accurate picture of the scene, they notice that the body is wrapped in a number of materials, layers of sheets, blankets, garbage bags, and then wrapped in duct tape, sort of like a mummy, very tightly around and around, so that everything just stuck together. Of course, all these materials are melted together from the fire. It's clear to the troopers that this is not where this person died. They were brought to this location to be disposed of like trash on the side of the road. It's heartless. Clearly, a person doesn't do this to themselves. So, troopers called homicide investigators along with crime scene technicians to begin to collect evidence, take pictures, and prepare the body to be transported to the medical examiner's office. I want to show you some pictures of the scene from that night. This right here is the road that Russell was driving down. It's so dark that the troopers had to bring out a floodlight so that they could see what was going on. You can see one of those lights right here on the left side. That is where the remains were found. The yellow crime scene tape is up, along with cones blocking off the road. The state police van is there on the right, and in the middle, that's one of the trooper squad cars. Now the second picture is from a vantage point of that squad car looking towards the opposite direction. Right here, this blurred out section is exactly where the fire was, and of course where the body was found. You can see what is most likely Russell's truck pulled over to the left. Here's a better look at that floodlight illuminating the area of interest. Look how close this is to the road. You can also see how empty this area is as far as evidence is concerned. Everything is in one concentrated area and only consists of the body and the material it was wrapped in. Lastly, here is a view from much closer, just to show you how close this was to the roadside. It's as though the person who disposed of this body just opened up their car door and threw them out. No effort at all to hide anything, of course, except lighting it on fire and expecting it to be destroyed. But thankfully, these men were there in the nick of time. You can even see smoke emanating from this area in this picture. It's just so eerie. Sometimes I debate about even showing any pictures of the scene. But of course, I do my best to respectfully conceal anything too gruesome while balancing being as informative and detailed as possible. You probably know how much I like to dig in and find out where these locations are and what they look like today. I was able to use those crime scene photos to pinpoint exactly where this was. Here's a picture of the location on Google Maps, and you can see here is the same sign on the right, the guardrails, the pole here on the left, and even this tiny pole at the end of the rail on the left side where they found the remains. I wondered why there were guardrails. Why did they need them here? I looked over, and that's exactly why, because there is water right here. It's interesting for me to look at this area so many years later. The remains were transported to the Connecticut State Medical Examiner, Dr. Ira Canfer. He had 30 years of experience in his field and conducted over 4,000 autopsies. He would be carrying out the exam on this body the next morning, on Saturday, December 5th. Let me explain his initial findings to you. He observed a partially burned body wrapped in layers, which he began to carefully and meticulously remove little by little. He wanted to preserve as much of them as possible for evidentiary purposes. This is a very difficult and tedious job, with a lot of pressure to get things perfect because you only have one chance to determine who this person is, what happened to them, and who did it. Justice depends on it. No personal items were collected from the scene of the fire. However, canines did alert in that area that an accelerant had been used and they could smell the presence of gasoline. Now, every piece of evidence on the body is photographed and bagged, then sent to the police crime lab. That's where analysts will examine it in detail, run all the DNA tests, and look for trace evidence. I want to show you what these layers of material looked like at the scene so you can get a better understanding of what he was dealing with. This right here looks to be a thick blue blanket. It appears to have red stains on it that would be suspected blood at this point before being tested. You can see that to the left, at the end of the blanket, there's a red tie on a black garbage bag, and beyond that, there's a strip of silver duct tape. As we move to the left, you can see more garbage bags, as well as burnt debris, just ashes and destroyed materials. They really don't look like much, but they give you some perspective on what this doctor had to work through just to get down to the actual body so he could start his examination. Once he was able to remove all the outer wrappings, he got a much better view of the deceased individual and determined it was a young female. As far as ethnicity was concerned, from what he gathered from the skin that was still intact, she appeared to be of Asian descent, possibly Latina, or even a light complexion African American. Her hair was cut off, her nose was cut off, her fingers were removed, as well as all of her toes. Her ears had been taken off her head, as well as chunks of skin. They had been excised, cut away, and it was left with deep gouges. One of those areas was on her right outer ankle. The skin was removed in a section. The front of the body was burned more than the back. But luckily, The fire had been put out fast enough to where only the outer layer of skin had been charred. So as Dr. Canfer carefully turned her over, he could tell that she had been placed face up before being lit on fire. Her back had not been burned. It remained in contact with the ground, and there was apparently a large section of skin that had been removed from the lower portion of her back. The areas that were mutilated and removed were ones that could have had identifying characteristics to them. For example, we know that fingerprints can be used to identify someone. Therefore, the killer removed them. They may have believed that toes could have toe prints, or that the fingers and toes could have been painted in a certain way, and the killer wanted to remove them so that their loved ones wouldn't recognize the victim. The ears could contain earrings, identifiable heirlooms passed down generation to generation. The nose could have a marking on it, like a birthmark or a mole, or even a nose ring. So, the perpetrator in haste could choose to just cut these areas off the body instead of taking out every piercing. It makes sense. However, the killer must not have looked in the victim's mouth because he left two things behind: a tongue ring and all of her teeth. Teeth are as good as fingerprints as far as identifying someone is concerned, as long as they have dental records. Our teeth are naturally very unique, different shapes and sizes and positions, but also our dental work is a huge indicator that you have the right person identified. Fillings, dental implants, anything that shows up on an X-ray and has been documented can be matched to a victim. Even if the teeth are removed, if the jaw is still there, then they can use dental records, and in many of those cases, they can see evidence of dental work left behind. It's very interesting, but now for the internal exam and those findings. The doctor's job is twofold. He has to designate a cause and manner of death. Determining a cause of death is harder than the manner of death because of the burns. One thing he wants to know is whether this person was alive before the fire started. So, he looks to the lungs to see if there's any soot present, and there isn't, which means that she did not inhale any smoke. Therefore, he determines that she was deceased before her body was set on fire. But because of the burns, external injuries are harder to locate, so you have to look at the organs on the inside. Dr. Canfer locates a laceration on the liver, as well as 200 cc's of blood in the abdominal cavity, which at this point had started to clot. There are also 4 sharp force injuries to her neck. It's not readily apparent whether or not they happened pre- or post-mortem because of all the burning, but this wound to the liver is enough to determine that it was the cause of death, and the manner is determined to be homicide. Now this begins a homicide investigation. As soon as that doctor signs an autopsy report with the manner of death as homicide, a full-blown investigation is on. Since they don't know who this woman is, Connecticut detectives search through all of their current missing persons reports, but they don't find any that match her description. So, they widen their search to other districts and surrounding areas, and put out an alert with all the physical characteristics that they determined existed on their Jane Doe, including the fact that she had a tongue piercing. Well, detectives back in Suffolk County are checking all the reports like they do every day, and this alert of this Jane Doe stands out because of that tongue piercing. Becky had her tongue pierced. It's something that she and her friends did together. You can see them in this picture right here. I mentioned it was unique, pink with a butterfly. Well, Jane Doe has the exact same one. It's not enough by itself to say this is Becky, but Suffolk County believes it is. They already have Becky's DNA and dental records, so they hand them over to Connecticut to confirm whether this is Becky or not. And it doesn't take long for them to make the heartbreaking confirmation that the body found on the side of the road was that of 24-year-old Rebecca Koster. That is so sad. Her family had been holding out hope. They also realized that the descriptions of where Becky had tattoos and piercings corresponded with the areas that had been excised and cut off her body. Clearly, this killer tore her apart. Her ears, they had distinctive earrings, especially that top left one with the bar. That's why he removed it. Her nose was cut off because she had a nose stud. Her hair was removed because it was long and had a texture that someone could identify. And then her tattoos, to think how much time it took for this monster to cut her tattoos from her skin. It's December 9th, 5 days since Becky had gone missing, and her friends and family are exhausted. They had been working non-stop, trying to find her. Now they had heard about the unidentified body found on the side of the road in Connecticut, but they never, not once, thought to connect it to Becky. They were still looking for a missing person, not a dead one. That day, after working so hard, they wanted a break. They needed to get out of the house, just to have some sense of normalcy. So a group of them headed to a restaurant to get a bite to eat. It was the first time they had gone out to do anything that wasn't related to finding Becky since she disappeared. They had just sat down and ordered their food when, suddenly, Larry got a phone call. He hung up and told everyone, "Stop what you're doing, we've got to go." It was Detective Frendo. They needed to come home because there had been a break in the case. They tossed cash on the table and rushed home. Their first thought was, oh my God, they found her. Of course, they were hoping for the best, for positive news. They were hoping they'd walk in and Becky would be standing there in the living room, arms outstretched in a happy reunion. Larry and Damon arrived home first, and the detectives were already there. He quickly unlocked the door and let them in. They didn't wait for Barbara to arrive before delivering the heartbreaking news to Becky's stepdad and 15-year-old brother. Not too long after, Barbara and the others arrived. When she walked in and saw her husband's face, she knew it wasn't good, but she still wanted to hold on to hope. She turned to the detective and asked, "Is it bad news? Did you find her?" He told her to please take a seat. She insisted, "Don't say it, don't say it." But he looked at her and said, "We found her, but I'm very sorry, she's been murdered." Barbara lost control. She grabbed her coat, ran out into the cold, down the driveway, and screamed, "Someone murdered my baby. They killed my baby." She said it felt like half her heart had been ripped from her chest. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't believe that Becky would never come back home again, that she'd never see her face, hug her, or hear her voice again. Now, we hear so many stories, and sometimes we don't sit with those feelings and realizations. We forget that this is real. We don't take a minute to pause and imagine what this must feel like for this mother. This is a real family. They spent 24 years raising their daughter, years of hard work, providing for her, teaching her, watching her grow up, and being in awe of how amazing she was. They had so much hope for her future. When something like this happens, it's not just that your child dies, a piece of you dies too. Nicole was stunned when she heard the detective deliver the news about her best friend of 10 years. She didn't understand how this could have happened. Larry was numb. He didn't know what to feel. He had been in Becky's life a long, long time. How could someone do this to someone so special? He kept thinking about how many hours he'd spent the day before, handing out 180 flyers over 8 hours. He thought to himself, I can't go back to all those places and tell them to take him down because she's dead. Detective Frendo, a father himself with 2 kids, promised Becky's family that he would find out who did this and ensure they got what they deserved. Then they all sat down with him as he explained what they knew so far, including how poor Becky had died and how she was found. He explained everything they had learned from law enforcement in Stonington, Connecticut. Becky's body had been found less than 24 hours after she disappeared. When Barbara heard this, she was disgusted. She realized there was no way those text messages she had received were from Becky. Her remains had already been discovered around the same time that Larry had been calling to report her missing. Barbara couldn't even begin to process the fact that Becky's killer was the one sending those messages, giving them false hope, tormenting them. He had been reading all of her desperate, heartfelt messages to her daughter. It was just too much to take in. Who would do such a thing? Well, the same type of person who did all of those other horrific things that the detectives relayed to this poor family. With each detail, Barbara felt sick. She used to warn Becky that she was a prime target. She'd say, "You're so beautiful, all these men are after you," but Becky just shrugged it off. She never thought anyone would do anything like this. This was her mother's worst nightmare. How could someone stab her in the liver, mutilate her, and then throw her away like trash? All she wanted to do was see Becky again, but she knew that wouldn't be possible, not the way she was before. This wouldn't be Becky. Everything that made her her was gone. She couldn't comprehend the kind of evil person that could commit such an act. She said, "There are demons out there that look like people." When Larry heard the details, he was praying that she was already dead before the body was set on fire. He said, "This happened at 7:30. It's not like it was even dark. Someone had to have seen something." But it was pretty dark, considering where this area was. There were no streetlights here. But I understand his point. They want answers. Once the news of Becky's murder was out, the media couldn't wait to speak with the family. Both Larry and Barbara went on camera. They were so brave. They sat in their home and expressed their shock, heartache, and disgust at the person who killed their daughter, and who continued to taunt them by sending text messages from her phone. This is also something the Long Island serial killer did. He taunted at least one of the victim's family members. The calls were being made using the victim's phone, and in one of these calls, the caller admitted to killing her and doing very perverse things to her body. And recently, those calls were traced to a location in Midtown Manhattan, near where the man that's in custody right now, Rex, had an office. So similar, using the victim's phone and tricking their family. Well, in Becky's case, Barbara said she felt stupid for believing that it was her daughter sending those texts, but it was the only hope she had. It's what kept her going. "I felt so sorry for her. Don't feel stupid because you did everything right. You kept in contact with her, trying to trace her phone. The only person that should feel stupid, and so many other things, is the killer. How dare he pretend to give them hope?" Barbara said on camera, addressing the killer, "How would your mother feel if she got that message? We want closure. We just want to know who murdered our daughter, and they should pay for it." News of this murder has everyone in the community scared that there is a killer on the loose. Detective Frendo is going back to the evidence they have at this point, and he decides to ask everyone who was with Becky that night at Butcher Boys if they remember anyone acting suspiciously. Well, Becky's friend Jennifer remembers something. There was a guy at the bar that no one knew, and he kept coming up and trying to work his way into their group, sitting next to them, trying to talk to the women, making them feel uncomfortable. He was very pushy and creepy, especially with all the questions he was asking. And then he grabbed Jennifer's phone, took it right out of her hand, and proceeded to put his number and his name inside as one of her contacts. Jennifer provides Detective Frendo with this information. His name is Jay Brown, and guess what? It's a 617 number, just like the one that called Becky that night. The last call Becky answered before she was killed. They compared the two numbers. They were an exact match. They had Jennifer take a look at the CCTV footage, and sure enough, she identifies the man seen sitting right next to Becky that night as the same one who took her phone and was aggressively coming on to them. She recalled he was about 6 feet tall, African American, and very nicely dressed, with a long-sleeve sweater vest on. As they keep going through the footage, they examine the video around 2:30 a.m., and that is when they see Becky standing at the bar waiting for her drinks. The man Jennifer has identified as this aggressive guy who took her phone and put his number in without her permission is sitting there talking to Becky. At first, it looked like Becky wanted to interact with this man and that she had exchanged numbers. But now it seemed more like Becky was just trying to be nice to a man who was clearly being manipulative and forcefully taking her phone. She was probably intimidated enough to give him her number so he would leave her alone. That's who Becky was. She was nice. She didn't want to hurt people's feelings. And honestly, who thinks that by simply giving a guy your number, it would lead to your murder? Well, many of us, because we hear stories like this, don't we? The video shows Becky having 2 or 3 drinks before this interaction even occurred. Intoxication is another element of this case that explains some of the things I've seen in relation to victim blaming. I hope to dispel some of those rumors and assumptions about what really happened that night. I have to, after what I saw. And I will get to that in a little while, but in order to get to that part, I have to get to who this Jay Brown guy is. This is about to get intense. Remember how the medical examiner took his time to remove every little piece of material that Becky had been wrapped in? Well, that was all sent to the lab, and they're looking at the duct tape. They decide to try pulling fingerprints from it. Now typically, they get prints from the outside part, the shiny part, not the sticky part. For a number of reasons, it's harder to work with. People usually press on the non-sticky side. And of course, considering the tape was in a fire, they didn't really expect to get anything from the sticky side, but they didn't find any on the outside of the tape, so they said, why not just give it a shot? Well, thankfully they did, because it was almost a miracle. They found two latent prints, a right and left thumbprint. The killer may have remembered to remove all of Becky's fingers, but he couldn't really do anything about his own two thumbs. Thumbs up for this diligent forensics team. This is a very rare find. So they run these prints through the database in Connecticut and they don't get a hit, so they pass them on to Suffolk County. They run the prints through the New York system, and on December 11th they get a hit. A 29-year-old man named Evans Ganthier. Now they have two names, this guy and Jay Brown, the person from the bar. Well, nothing comes up for Jay Brown, so they obtain background information on Evans Ganthier. He was born on January 20th, 1980. He attended St. Anthony's High School in South Huntington on Long Island and graduated in 2007 from Ding College in Oakdale, New York, where he earned a bachelor's degree in psychology. The address on his license was 38 Miller Avenue, Central Islip, New York, which is about 15 minutes from Becky's. However, that place doesn't match where the phone traveled the night she disappeared, so they continue looking into how this man could be connected to her. When they ran his social security number, he was not listed as being employed anywhere. However, there were two business listings matching his name and the address of 38 Miller Avenue. One was called Secrets Adult Entertainment Services, which appeared to be currently active and in business. The other one was for a listing called Happy Time Entertainment. Interestingly, when the police called the number on the listing for Happy Time, a woman answered. She said it used to be a kids' party business but was no longer in operation, and she had not spoken to Evans in a very long time. She wouldn't even give the police her name, clearly not wanting to be associated with this man at all. It's already sounding very weird. Just the combo alone, kids' party and adult entertainment, that's quite a broad range of business ventures, unless this creep was combining them, which is just gross. Moving on, this man had been arrested at least 5 times. 4 were misdemeanors, he was convicted of 2, and a couple were adjudicated cases. However, he had 1 case pending because he failed to appear in court. If you're wondering what these charges were for, well, among other things, one was a domestic incident with an ex-girlfriend, and there were allegations that he was pimping her out and running a business consisting of taking photographs of women in his garage in Port Jefferson Station. Now that area was the location where Becky's phone and the unknown caller's phone traveled the night she went missing. Now they're on to something. It turns out the 38 Miller Avenue address was Evans's mother's house. When they gave both of these names, Jay Brown and Evans Ganthier, to Becky's friends and family, they were at a loss. They had no idea who either of these people was. While investigators let them know that Evans's thumbprints matched the duct tape on Becky's body, Jennifer came down to the station and was shown a photo array that included Evans's picture. She was able to positively identify him as the man who took her phone from her. Jay Brown was Evans's alias. On December 14th, they issued a warrant for Evans Ganthier's arrest. The detectives had already been tracking his movements. They sent officers to every location they could find that was connected to him. The vehicle Evans had received some tickets on while driving was an SUV. They looked at it and found it parked in front of his girlfriend's house in the Bronx. They waited outside until he came out the front door, and they immediately arrested him without incident. Becky's family was so happy that someone was in custody, but there were so many unanswered questions, like why he would do this. When Frendo interviewed Evans, telling him that they believed he was responsible for killing, dismembering, and setting Becky's body on fire after getting her number from Butcher Boys in the early morning hours of December 4th, of course, he denied knowing anything about her. He said he clearly remembered he didn't go out that night because it was his sister's birthday. He couldn't remember the last time he was even at Butcher Boys. Do people think cameras don't exist? Friendo told Evans there was a video of him at Butcher Boy's talking with women early on December 4th. So then, Evans said, "Oh yeah, I was there. I forgot. I have a bad memory." When they showed him a video of him actually talking to Becky, that's when he acknowledged meeting her that night. He said they exchanged numbers, but that was it. Friendo asked if Evans liked to go out to bars, and he said he did, adding, "I've met a lot of girls the last few weeks. Girls would just get drunk, jump in my car, and I'd drive them home." Well, Friendo was like, "Through cell phone information, we were able to figure out that your phone was in the same location as Becky's house around 4:30 a.m. on December 4th, with Becky's phone in the same location. Then they both traveled towards your house in Port Jefferson Station." That's when Evans changed his story again. Every time they presented him with a new piece of evidence, the narrative changed. Now he was like, "Right, yes, I did meet her at her house, but it was never for sex or drugs or anything. We were just talking and hanging out." He even mentioned that she said she couldn't hang out long because she had work in the morning. But he asked her if she wanted to come to his place for just a little while, and she agreed. He said they hung out for a bit, and then he brought her back home. He spent the next few days with his girlfriend. Evans insisted nothing happened, and that they could search his house and car. He gave consent, saying, "You're not going to find anything since I didn't hurt her." This went on for 2 hours, with him just denying anything had happened to Becky. What's important to point out is that there's always truth hidden in between lies. What was gathered here was that he specifically pointed out he didn't want drugs or sex, two things that were most likely involved. Drugs could have been used to lure Becky, since she enjoyed smoking and had been looking for a friend to meet up with before Evan stepped in that night. And sex, that's what he wanted, and what Becky wasn't interested in giving him. That is why she's dead. We'll get more into what made Becky get into his car later, as that's where a lot of victim blaming has been placed on Becky. But back to the interview. When Friendo told him that his thumbprints were on the duct tape found on Becky's body, his story changed dramatically. Are you ready for this? He finally told Friendo that he wouldn't believe him if he told him what really happened that night. Friendo was like, "Try me." Evan said he asked Becky to come back to his house, and she agreed. They were driving there, but all of a sudden she began frothing at the mouth, having trouble breathing and gagging. He began freaking out. He had this girl with him, and she was sick, having some kind of overdose or reaction to something. He was close to his house, so he figured, you know what? I'll grab her a cup of water, that'll help. But when he was getting her out of the car and walking her through his garage door, she wasn't steady enough to walk by herself. He said she seemed intoxicated. But more than that, she was out of it. He insisted he was trying to get her inside to get that water, but as she was walking in his garage, she tripped over a set of 50-pound dumbbells on the floor. He mentioned his girlfriend always tripped on stuff too, like, "I wish I would have just cleaned up around here." He said normally Becky would have probably braced herself and broken her fall, but in whatever state she was in, she just slammed her head onto the hard concrete and was knocked out. So he ran over to her. He didn't know what to do. She didn't look conscious, though she was still breathing, but having trouble. He put her in the back of his SUV and rushed to get to the nearest hospital, but she stopped breathing before they got there. Realizing he had a criminal record and was the last person with her, he panicked. In his words, he said, "It would look bad if a black man drove up to a hospital with a dead white girl. I could be mistaken, but I didn't know Becky was white. They never confirmed her ethnicity, but looking at her mother, uncle, and other blood relatives, I'd guess she's biracial or multiracial." But I digress. Those were his words and his impression of Becky. So he says, in a panic, he went home. When he checked on her, she wasn't breathing. He panicked even more. He had a dead girl in his house and couldn't keep her there. He didn't know what to do with her and didn't want anyone to think he hurt her. He needed to get rid of her, and definitely in a way that no one would be able to identify her. In this panicked state, he said he cut off her hair, fingertips, toes, nose, and carved out her 2 tattoos so no one could identify her. Then, he wrapped her in plastic and a photo backdrop that he had hanging in his garage. Afterward, He put her in the back of his SUV, drove to the port in Port Jefferson, and took the ferry to Connecticut. Then he bought some duct tape and gloves and found a motel to stay in. At first, he told investigators he dismembered her in his garage, but then he changed his story, saying, no, it was at this motel in Connecticut. Afterward, he scattered her body parts across southern Connecticut while driving around looking for a place to dispose of her. He was so tired that he had to rest until it got dark. Then he found a spot in North Stonington where he dumped her body, poured gasoline on top, lit her on fire, and drove away. But he insists he never killed her. Nope, it was just a huge accident, and he feels so awful that this happened to this poor girl. He was playing the victim in all of this, I kid you not, because she had just been so messed up. She tripped in his garage and died in his vehicle, leaving him looking like a killer. And of course, Frendo doesn't believe this for a minute, especially because he knows the cause of death was a stab wound to Becky's liver. But Evans probably thought that her body was so badly burned that they wouldn't even be able to tell the cause of death. Frendo didn't want to reveal that right now. He wanted Evans to keep lying. The next claim he made was that they can't prove beyond a reasonable doubt that he killed her, since he didn't. Okay, I just have to say this. If it was an accident, accidents happen. Let me tell you what you do. You do the normal thing. You call the police, and you tell them because it can be proven. Even if it's more up in the air and you have to prove it in court, what he did isn't something that someone does when they witness an accident. They don't desecrate a body, they don't hide a body. Instead, they try to get medical attention, even if it fails. He plays the victim card. Oh, why did she have to die on me like this? At the same time this interview is going on, his house is being searched. In the garage, there was sort of a photography area set up with a camera and lights. This was most likely where he conducted his adult entertainment business, taking photos of women. As they continued to search, they found a paint roller, a scrub brush, a broom, cement cleaner, paint, and a paint tray, and they looked like they had just been used. They see a large portion of cement in the garage that had been cleaned and painted over in a big square, just an area on the floor painted. But there's nothing linking Becky to the garage. It's all circumstantial because he cleaned up and put all that paint over it. There was no DNA that they could get. Evans says this is just where, Becky fell and was gagging and frothing at the mouth. But the story gets even more wild. Evans said that when her phone started getting all those text messages from her family and her friends, he pretended to be Becky and say that she had been held captive by her boyfriend, Dan. From the context of her own messages, he was able to ascertain that her boyfriend was Dan, and she also told him that when talking to him at the bar. This is also not something that someone who witnessed an accident would do. They wouldn't try to throw off the case and try to pass blame. He told Frendo that he knows this looks bad, but, quote, his girl chasing days finally caught up with him, end quote. Wow, that's the description of what happened. His curse for chasing women, which remember he said, oh no, it wasn't for sex. But this is his curse, his punishment for chasing women. That one accidentally dies on him. What do you even think of this? Evans explained that he scrubbed and painted that garage floor after he returned from Connecticut, and then he left to be with his girlfriend. Now for reference, I need to show you something to make sure this makes sense. He did not drive over 100 miles to Connecticut when he said he drove his car to the port. He got on a ferry, his car went on the ferry. This is what it looks like. It takes you across the Long Island Sound. You drive onto it with your car, and it drops you off at the port in Connecticut. He thought he was smart. Okay, remember when I told you it was going to get even more wild? Well, Frendo is like, great story, bro. He didn't really say that, but pretty much he's like, interesting story, except Becky died from a stab wound to her liver. Well, Evans gets all flustered. He says, no, that can't be possible. No, I have no reason to stab her. Why would I stab her? We were just hanging out. Frendo tells Evans that he knows something went wrong between him and Becky that led to him stabbing her, but Evans insisted that he didn't. He said, quote, if there were problems, I wouldn't need a knife. Frendo was like, well, I'm not sure about that because of what you did to Rebecca, and that's when Evans was yelling. He's like, that was only to hide her identity. I didn't kill her. He's not a knife person. Wow, a person who uses a knife, even as to continue to mutilate an innocent girl, wants us to believe he's not a knife person. I wonder what his weapon of choice is then. His hands? Like he put on his ex-girlfriend. Evans was fine with describing that he cut Becky's body up to hide her identity, but he wouldn't stand for anyone saying he stabbed her. He merely chose to do the wrong thing when she accidentally fell. He said, quote, "I had a knife in my hand. I made a mistake. I can't take it back." End quote. But this was referring to disposing of her the way he did. The real murderer was apparently the dumbbells. Anytime Friendo would insist that Evans stabbed Becky, he would keep saying, "No, don't say that," and he would kind of close his eyes like it was painful for him to hear. Then he went on to use another excuse that he couldn't have stabbed her there in the liver. For reference, this is where the liver is located, the upper right-hand portion of the abdominal cavity. And if Becky was facing him, it would be on the left. Well, he said, "I couldn't have stabbed her there because I'm a righty," in his words. And Friendo said, "Well, we don't know what position Becky was in when she was stabbed, huh?" Well, that threw Evans off again, so he tried to counter it by saying, "Well, I don't even know where the liver is. This makes no sense." And what you're about to hear is probably the craziest thing I've heard someone say to try to explain away a stab wound. He said that maybe Friendo should go call Becky's parents. Want to know why? Because he said, quote, "Maybe she already had a stab wound to her liver." Are you kidding me? This woman bled out. Did you really think anyone was going to buy that? This is not a medical condition. It's not a scar from a surgery that happened years ago. It's a stab wound with blood leaking into her body. Blood that was clotting from sitting there over the course of hours that you hacked away at this poor woman. It's evil, and he's so unglued to think that anyone would believe that she already sustained this wound and was living with it, or it was a scar that the medical examiner mistakenly thought just happened on December 4th. No. Remember how I said there's always truth to lies? When Evan said that Becky started to froth at the mouth and gag in his vehicle out of nowhere, she probably did start to do that because that's exactly what would happen to someone who was stabbed in the abdomen and the neck. Let's not forget there are stabs to the neck. But it didn't happen out of nowhere. It happened when Evans tried to force himself on her, which was his intention from the minute he saw her and her friends at that bar. One of them was going to end up his victim that night, maybe not of murder but his sexual desires, and sadly it was Becky. She resisted, so he ended her life. Now, because of the murder charge against Evans, the assistant district attorney was now involved in the case, and her name is Janet Albertson. And she's so good. She's worked on other high-profile cases, she's aggressive, and she's feisty. Well, she is building a case against Evans, and she could tell he was going to try to claim that this is one big accident. The thing is, at the time that the autopsy was conducted and the report was done, it didn't go into full detail about head injuries or the lack thereof. The reason being, the liver wound had already been determined to be the cause of death, and the remains, sadly, were a jigsaw. So no investigation had even started. Plus, there was no reason to assume that anyone would fight the cause of death. But now this man is so... Albertson didn't want there to be any wiggle room at trial. She could not take that chance. She needed the medical examiner to go back and examine Becky to make sure there was no way this fall could have caused her to die. But this posed a problem, one that I have never seen in any other case that I've talked about. Remember when the medical examiner makes a determination about a homicide? That's when the investigation begins. Well, the opposite is also true. When the medical examiner updates the manner of death and there's no homicide, for example, in this case when it's pending further investigation, well, as crazy as it sounds, it meant they wouldn't have a homicide charge to be brought against Evans, so they would have to let him go. They had nothing to charge him with because at that time they couldn't take the risk. It's different now because now they could have held him on mutilating a corpse, but back in 2009, there was no law regarding corpse mutilation. So they had no choice, they had to release him and wait. Her family, I'm sure you can imagine, is shocked and confused. There are so many back and forth feelings you don't know what is true, and the waiting is so hard. Barbara described it as gut-wrenching. Her mind was in a whirlwind. There was no rest until this man was behind bars. And of course, Albertson explained this to Becky's family. She knew it was going to be really hard on them to know that Becky's killer was on the loose, but she assured them that this was to make sure he didn't get away with this. He's intelligent, he's well-spoken, he's cunning and convincing, even charming. So a jury, they could lean his way if they didn't make sure that, like he said, they could prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. And I want to point out that Albertson explained one reason it's easy to believe that Becky felt comfortable with the stranger was because he didn't look threatening. That was on purpose. The way that he was dressed, he presented a clean-cut, safe image, someone who appeared kind. In the eyes of the Suffolk County Police Department and the district attorney, he gave off the impression that he was harmless and trustworthy. The district attorney said that Evans was the kind of person who would not have been suspected of causing any harm to Becky. She said he was a predator. He knew how to make himself appear very nice and inviting. Remember that, because this woman has thoroughly analyzed him, unlike the people online who call Becky stupid for, as they put it, cheating on her boyfriend and getting killed. That's not what happened here, and I better not see it in my comment section. I know none of you are victim-blaming people, but Becky was tricked. She was under the influence and let her guard down, thinking that they were just going to smoke a little weed outside of her house. He probably parked right on her street. She thought it would take maybe 20 minutes or so, and he'd be on his way, allowing her to go back inside, get some rest, and wake up at 6 a.m. for work. He even said that Becky told him she couldn't hang out long. So why do you think she would have agreed to go to his house? She didn't, and we'll get there. But after he was released, the medical examiner was back to assessing the injuries to Becky's body. Meanwhile, searches were being conducted inside Evie's car, and they also used cell phone towers to map the locations that Evans went to in Connecticut. There's video footage from Port Jefferson Ferry showing Evans getting out of his car and going up the steps as it was crossing the ferry. He wasn't scared at all. He was on a mission. That's what he looked like. They located all the places his phone was in Connecticut, including a grocery store. And guess what? They asked for receipts and camera footage. Why go to another state to purchase duct tape and gloves? He crossed state lines to buy his supplies. It's not something an innocent person does. The grocery store footage was very important because they were watching his body language. He said he was panicked and that he had to think so fast he didn't know what to do. And that's why he did this to Becky. Not true. This man was calm. He was a confident man thinking he was getting away with murder. When he was at the store buying the duct tape and the gloves, he wasn't shaking. He wasn't fumbling and dropping things out of fear. He wasn't looking around anxiously. No, he was smooth. He was smiling, interacting with the cashier, taking his time, so much so that he even made sure he got the right change and a receipt for his purchase. All of that was not the behavior of a person who was panicked, all the while knowing he was about to use this stuff to wrap her up and set her on fire. Oh, those gloves didn't work so well, did they? I bet you he's the type to ask for a refund. That's how arrogant he is. And stay with me because the medical examiner has some very interesting findings. According to Evans, Becky hit her head and died. Well, for a head injury to be fatal, it has to be pretty significant. It's possible, of course, but not likely from a fall like Evans described. Evans may have tried to be convincing. However, science, anatomy, biology, to be more specific, let's start with the skull. There were no skull fractures. The skull is strong, it protects the brain. It's solid, and there's no evidence of blunt force trauma to the head at all. No brain bleeds, nothing. No inflammation or swelling of the brain. That was not the cause of Becky's death. However, Evans, being as clever as he was, may try to argue that the liver wound happened as a result of the fall. And it is possible, again, not likely that someone's liver can be lacerated from a fall, but it can happen. So remember those additional stab wounds to the neck. Well, the medical examiner wants to know whether these wounds were fatal or not, because this would be an additional cause of death if they happened before Becky died and not after she was dead. The prosecutor wanted to make sure they left no room for Evans to argue that those neck wounds happened because, as disgusting as it sounds, maybe he was attempting to cut off Becky's head instead of cutting each area like the ears and the nose. It's very hard, so he hesitated. Well, The aide wanted to ensure there was nothing that Evans could lean on. So, under further examination, veins and arteries are located in the neck, and if one of those is cut while the person is alive, air gets sucked into that vein or artery, and that air travels to the heart. When it does, it stops beating and the person dies. So Dr. Camper takes a chest X-ray, which shows a pocket of air in Becky's heart. The blood air level in the heart shows that the neck wounds happened while Becky was alive. Air got sucked into that venous system and stopped the heart. So that stab wound would have killed her on its own, as well as the liver wound. So the official cause of death, multiple stab wounds of the neck and liver, manner of death is back to homicide. Not only that, the investigators discovered red stains throughout the vehicle that Evans drove that night, and it was determined to be blood. It had been dripping down the center console on both sides, and on the driver's side, the blood continued to drip downward into the space between the seat and the console, and somehow made its way to the back of the driver's seat and inside the right rear door pocket. It went all the way down to the floorboards, where it then pooled. This was a significant amount of blood. It wasn't some frothing at the mouth because she was on drugs or sick, as he was claiming. That part of the story was to make an excuse about why Becky's DNA would be in his car. Nice try. The DNA matched to Becky, and the odds it belonged to her were 1 in 28.9 quintillion. That's a number with 18 zeros at the end. No doubt this man killed her in his car, just like what happened to Samantha Josephson in the mistaken Uber driver case that I discussed. It took close to 2 months for all of this investigative work to be done, and meanwhile, Evans really thought he was going free. He planned a vacation to Atlantic City with his girlfriend, so he was pretty upset when they arrested him for the second time on February 8, 2010. He said, quote, he was so upset about what happened to Becky, he wasn't even eating anymore or going to bars to pick up girls, end quote. He said he could just picture someone doing this to his sister. He's still playing the victim. He said he was forced to tell his girlfriend what he had chosen to do after the accident, and Friendo said he was really surprised that he would tell her that. Evan says, oh yeah, she was really upset, and it's understandable. Friendo responded to that with, maybe she feels like she's next, and Evan literally tells him that that's exactly what his girlfriend said. Yeah, I don't know why she didn't run after the first time he was arrested. Evans actually asked Friendo if he could meet Becky's family to apologize, and of course he said, no, why don't you write them a letter instead? So that's what he did. He stated, among other things, that, quote, after she passed away, I should have reacted the right way, but like a self-centered idiot, I panicked. I'm so sorry for the things to her body, end quote. The police retained this letter as evidence, and wow, if that's not a sign of a sociopath, I don't know what is. I'm echoing what the assistant district attorney said because she too referred to him as such, and she would know. She studied this man extensively. As a matter of fact, after his interviews, she psychologically analyzed every one of his words, preparing to unravel each one of his lies at trial. The memorial service for Becky was held the week after she was identified. Barbara said the funeral was beautiful, with a pink casket and roses, Becky's favorite color, and flowers. So many people came to express their love for her. Their service was held at the St. James Funeral Home, and she was laid to rest at the Washington Memorial Park Cemetery in Mount Sinai, Long Island. It was a touching tribute to a beloved person who had left the world way too soon. I want to tell you the outcome of the trial, but before I do, here's the message to all the people I saw online bashing this poor victim, blaming her for her murder. No, Becky was a young woman. She was only 24, and that may seem adult enough to know everything, but you don't. We don't. We're all going through life at our own pace. We have different life experiences, and maybe Becky wasn't fortunate enough to watch videos like this one or true crime shows on TV when she was growing up. Not only was she trying to navigate life, but also navigate being a woman. That's the reason Becky was murdered, because she was a gorgeous woman that a man wanted to use for his pleasure. Don't get it twisted. Becky was innocent, she was kind, and she was trusting. She gave people the benefit of the doubt. Evans was a cunning criminal with a twisted mind, cruel intentions, and the ability to fool a woman who was out with her friends and her boyfriend, having drinks like millions of other people do. There was nothing wrong about what she did, but on lipstickalley.com, there was an entire thread entitled "Woman Shamed and Blamed for Her Murder." The author was specifically looking through comments on other YouTube videos about this case, where people were lacing into Becky, calling her a cheater, and saying that she got what she deserved for cheating on her boyfriend. Many comments I saw said, "Oh well, she had a boyfriend, why is she giving out her number?" But there were ones that were much worse. Here are some of those lovely comments. Now I'm gonna put them on the screen. "She died because she was being a hoe," or what about this one? It just says, "Karma." How about this quote? "This is why you be loyal, her fault." I'm disgusted. This one read, Rebecca and Dan, find someone faithful. Because to be blamed for the murder of a loved one has to hurt as much as finding out that the guy who killed your girlfriend was who she was potentially cheating with. These vile comments go on and on. I didn't take these screenshots. They were posted by the person who wrote this post. I read so many of them, and I was shocked. One reason I think this happened is that this case had so much information that was not talked about in some of the other videos that were created about Becky. They never mentioned Jennifer. They didn't examine all the interviews and footage, which leaves too much to be assumed. Not only that, but even a cheater doesn't deserve to die. Sure, break up with them, but to say they deserve to be murdered and for their family to suffer? That's extreme, and we can do better. We don't know her. We have no way to know if dating a guy for less than a couple of months, if that was a committed relationship, and it's not our place to judge. Becky didn't approach Evans. She was one of many women who were targeted that night, and each one of them was given unwanted attention. Have you ever wanted a man to leave you alone so badly that you gave him your number? I have, and I had a boyfriend when I did it. He took her phone just like he did with Jennifer's, and we don't know if he texted himself from her phone. We know none of these things. Even if she willingly gave a stranger her number, her boyfriend was there. She wasn't hiding it. She had other guy friends like Jason. They were very close friends, but just friends. Not all partners think it's wrong to have friends of the opposite gender. Becky was the more the merrier type of person. She accepted everyone from everywhere she went. Both her mom and her best friend admitted that she used weed daily. It helped her in some way that seemed to benefit her. We don't know what Evans said to get Becky into his car. We don't. But the fact is, he mentioned drugs, so it makes it more likely than not that that's what he offered her. What I want to point out is that this man had been listening in on her friends' conversations, trying to work his way into their group, as if he were a part of it. He was talking to Becky and multiple women, making them feel uncomfortable with probing questions. I just gave you only a couple of scenarios that could have happened, but there are so many possibilities. It's not a woman being friendly, that's the issue. It's not sharing some weed together, though both of those things can be deadly for women because of men like this one. It's how the hashtag #TextMeWhenYouGetHome movement arose from the fact that we can't feel safe alone. Most men don't know what it feels like to be in constant fear that someone will kill you to sleep with you. Can you imagine? It sounds unreal, but it's true. An influencer named Lucy Mountain shared a now viral screenshot of a WhatsApp message on her Instagram feed that said, "Text me when you get home." That's how this movement began. She went on to explain that, "I've had conversations about how being hyper-conscious of our safety is something that we've done throughout our entire lives. The deep sense of connection is one of fear. We've all shared our live locations. We've all changed out of our shoes. We have all held keys between our fingers. We have all made phone calls, both real and fake. We've all tucked our hair inside of our coats. We've all run down dark roads, and we have all theorized our escape routes. Why? Because we're prey to some men. Everyone's a stranger before we get to know them, and we shouldn't have to worry that a man will kill us for having a joint with him, or merely meeting up or exchanging numbers. Think how utterly absurd it is to think that such a minor interaction would warrant murder." The last thing I want to say on this rant, which I thought was important, is that I'm sure if it was a guy who grabbed a smoke with another guy, no one would even give it a second thought. It's unfortunate that it seems like the responsibility lies with women to protect ourselves from predators and not with men to not kill us. But sure, be careful, because as Barbara said, there are demons out there that look like humans. So how did this case conclude? Evans is charged with second-degree murder in New York State. Second-degree murder is intentional murder. The state of mind needs to be that you acted in the moment with the intent to cause someone's death. When it came time for jury selection, there was a problem. Ultimately, many of the potential jurors were excused because of the gruesome nature of this case. The evidence that was going to be presented was bad. They didn't just have to look at it, they had to listen to what this man did to Becky in detail and analyze everything. Prosecutor Albertson told them, "You're going to hear very, very gruesome and very, very detailed, graphic detail about what was done to Becky's body." And she warned potential jurors that they would hear how Evans cut off all of her fingertips, toes, ears, nose, hair, and 2 tattoos of a woman, and then set her body on fire. Albertson said that the evidence will show Evans did all of this, not to obscure her identity, but to cover up the evidence of what he did. If they were going to sit on this case, then they would have to hear this evidence. One potential juror said, "I can't do this, just listening to you is disturbing, and I'm getting squeamish right now," so she was excused. One man said while shaking that it would probably make him sick to his stomach, so he was excused. Another man said, "I've got major cotton mouth right now and my stomach is in knots." These potential jurors didn't make the cut because they couldn't stand to watch the cuts that Evans made to Becky's body during jury selection. The defense attorney, William Kaihan, was focused on whether the potential jurors believed that innocent people can be charged with crimes and if they thought detectives ever lied in court. You see what direction he was going in. Well, finally, by July of 2013, the trial began, and it went on for 4 weeks. Prosecutor Albertson showed everything that I told you about. Her belief is that Evans purposely appeared as someone trustworthy who just wanted to connect with other people who liked to hang out, smoke, and drink. He tried to blend in with Becky and her friends and be part of their group. Ultimately, he forcefully took Becky's and other women's phones and put his number inside under a fake name. Then he planned to use the things he pretended to have in common to lure one of them into his vehicle on December 4th, and it worked on Becky. However, he tricked her, and once inside, he attempted to force her to have sex with him, most likely at knife point. She resisted, and he stabbed her, either in the stomach first or the neck. He most likely grabbed one of her arms, pulling her forward toward his side of the car, and with his other hand, he stabbed her. That was why the blood was between the console on his side and hers. Once Becky began gagging and dying, Evans drove her back to his house, dismembered her, and you know the rest. This was no accident. This was the first time Becky's family heard all those details, which I didn't even go into. This trial was disturbing. At one point, Barbara left in tears. She had tried her best to sit there through every single second, but it was too much to take in when she heard details about how Evans said that the knife was bloody and dull after cutting off all of Becky's fingers and toes and ears and nose, and then it slipped while he was trying to use it to cut her hair. She ran away crying after that, but she did come back after that part was over, and all the pictures were no longer being shown. She couldn't believe the sight of Evans when he walked into that courtroom. He was smiling, he was blowing kisses to his family, and according to her, he was smug and confident the entire time. He showed no signs of remorse. She said that he did not care about the gravity of the situation, but he maintained his innocence. The defense tried to argue that Evans's version of what happened was true, that he never killed her. He just did the wrong thing after she died by accident. This is what he said. It was despicable, abhorrent, and shameful. There's no question that Evans Ganthier removed parts of Becky's body. There's no question that he set her body on fire, but there's no credible proof that he stabbed her in the abdomen. He continued, "I know it's extremely difficult for you not to convict him right now because of what he did to her body. Probably 8 of you want to do so right now." He went on to explain that if the cause of death was the liver, the external wound was 6 inches below the liver, and nothing between that wound and the liver was cut. and that was impossible. In his words, he said it's incredible, it's hocus pocus. But the medical examiner countered this by explaining that organs are not stationary. They move when we move. They don't just sit in one place, and yes, they can move while you're being stabbed, especially if being forcefully pulled. So the knife could have missed her stomach and pierced her liver. Assistant District Attorney Janet Albertson said, during her closing argument, that people fall all the time. She said, "You're not going to fall on a garage floor and lacerate your liver. The dumbbell that fell onto Rebecca is that one," and she pointed at Evans. When she pointed at him and said that his thumbprints were on the duct tape, this monster gave her 2 thumbs up, mocking her. Can you believe that? The callousness of that gesture is actually frightening, and that sealed his fate. Jurors couldn't believe it. She also pointed out that there was blood found on both sides of the console between the front seats of Gantier's car, and that pool of blood beneath the seat didn't come from transporting her body. That blood shouldn't be there. Innocent people don't do things like this. The jury deliberated for 5.5 hours, and they had a verdict: guilty. There were cries and sobs. Barbara said this was the best day of her life, and she yelled, "Becky, we got him. We got you justice." Now for the impact statements before sentencing, and I'll keep it brief. Barbara addressed the court and said, "I cry every day for my daughter, sometimes for hours at a time." She turned to Evans with anger and said, "I had to hear how you destroyed my Becky. No mother should ever see her daughter like that. I hate you. I hate you with every cell of my being, and I hope that everything you did to Becky is done to you." Larry said, "His lack of remorse and indifferent attitude, the attitude he's shown throughout this entire ordeal, is unacceptable, unforgivable, and leaves me with no doubts that the next time a pretty girl refuses him, he would have no hesitation in taking their life, just as he took the life of our beautiful Becky." Evans actually responded, saying that the evidence was weak. He said, "I feel the appellate courts will see that I am an innocent man," and then he apologized to Becky's family for their loss. Well, the state Supreme Court judge, Richard Ambrose, gave him the maximum prison sentence, stating, "Your version of events makes no sense. It was unthinkably cruel, and it leads strong support to the idea that her death was not an accident. Neither I nor the jury believes you." He imposed the maximum sentence, 25 to life in a maximum security prison, but he will be eligible for parole on February 4th, 2035, and that just seems way too soon. That is why I did this video. Remember me saying that I had to do it? Well, Barbara doesn't even like using Evans's name. She refers to him as it because she said he's not human, he's a demon. It lied, it said it didn't do it. It is evil, pure and simple. Her mother said that telling Becky's story is important because this demon is eligible for parole, and she doesn't want it out to harm anyone else or destroy another family like it has to theirs. I hope you share this story. The ADA believes that he should never get out. This person has no remorse and accepts zero responsibility for this crime. It's not possible, in her perception, to help someone or to rehabilitate them if they can't even admit what they did. Becky's mother feels a deep void that can never be filled. She misses Becky's laughter, even her complaints. Her presence is something that will never be replaced. Evans will never know the true extent of what he has taken from this world or the suffering that they had to endure. Becky's mom wears a heart-shaped necklace with a picture of her and Becky inside, and on the back it's engraved, "Always my blessing." She said that Becky was always a blessing, from the day she was born until the last day she saw her. She said, "She's not just my baby, she's my friend." I'm sorry, Barbara, I am so sorry. Picture yourself in your 20s, on the brink of achieving all your acting aspirations. You've secured an agent, your career is gaining momentum, and you've even signed with a record label while starting a charity for children. You've purchased your dream car, established a stable job, and surrounded yourself with a loving family, not to mention a new boyfriend. This was the reality for one woman. Despite her efforts to avoid the limelight, her innate star quality drew attention. She was genuinely living her dreams, but it only took one malicious individual to target her and shatter her future, wiping her from existence. I get to introduce you to the ambitious, beautiful, and warm-hearted young woman named Alexandra Marie Duxay. You can say it the way I just did, or as Alexandra, but I listened to the way that Alexandra herself preferred it to be pronounced. Hi, I'm Xandra, and I'm going with Alexandra. Actually, she was known as Xandra, or Zan, by her family and friends. She was born on December 9, 1979, in New Haven, Connecticut, and Xandra grew up in Milford, Connecticut, which is a city right smack in the middle of New Haven and Bridgeport. It's right by the sea and only an hour away from New York. Milford has a lot of sleepy residential neighborhoods and is a great area to raise your kids. It offers a charming blend of history and coastal living. It has a walkable historical district with well-preserved 18th and 19th century New England-style homes. Let me tell you a little about Xandra's parents, Linda Terranova Duxay and John Duxay. Linda grew up in Boston with her 6 siblings, received her master's degree, and taught English at a middle school. John was from Orlando, Florida, and worked in financial services. They got married in May of 1974 in Fairfield, Connecticut, and welcomed Xandra's older brother, Eric, in 1976, and her other older brother, Matthew, in 1978. When Xandra was born, she was the only girl, and she and Linda had a very special bond. Also, being the youngest, her brothers took her under their wing. But because they were all so close in age, the kids grew up playing sports together, going to the beach, eating Linda's home-cooked meals, and climbing the huge tree outside their home at 3 Booth Bay Street in Milford. It's a 4-bedroom, 2-bath home, and Linda made sure to keep it tidy and stylish. Eventually, the basement would become Xandra's own bedroom, gym, and hangout area. All the kids were super active, and Xandra did gymnastics and dance. In middle school, she did gymnastics with her best friend, Danielle. Xandra told Danielle that one day she wanted to be a famous actress and singer. Though the girls did drift apart over the years, Danielle looked up to Xandra. Many people did, and it's hard not to, because she was so ambitious and determined in whatever she put her mind to. Xandra was a true overachiever, and she stopped at nothing to make her dreams a reality. All throughout her childhood, Xandra participated in dance, but this was more than just a hobby. She was a very talented dancer. As she got older, she entered many contests and brought home a number of trophies. She dedicated countless hours to perfecting her craft, but she had ambitions that went well beyond the dance floor. She went to Jonathan Law High School, where she participated in choir and dance competitions. Her passion was hip-hop dance and tap. She also got a part-time job working for People's United Bank and met her first serious boyfriend, Matthew, when she was a teenager. Actually, she was about 16. I know she has a brother named Matthew, and that can be confusing in these kinds of stories, so I'm calling her brother Matthew, and I'm going to refer to her boyfriend as Matt. Matt swept her off of her feet. They could make each other laugh like nobody else, and they shared a love for working out and working hard in their careers. After graduating high school, Xandra stayed close to home, and she went to Albertus Magnus College in New Haven. She continued to work at People's Bank, working her way up the chain until she graduated magna cum laude and received all A's in each one of her classes. She was a very hard worker. Once she had her bachelor's degree, she was able to follow in her dad's financial footsteps, and she became a systems analyst at the bank. She reviewed bank transactions and managed the technology systems, which honestly sounds kind of complicated. Xandra worked at the bank for almost 10 years. She also got licensed as a real estate agent, and I know by looking into this that it takes at least 60 hours of classes, if not more. On top of all that, Xandra was singing, dancing, entertaining, modeling, and acting. She was busy, but it didn't end there. At 23 years old, Xandra became an assistant teacher at Gigi's Dance Academy, a school that teaches salsa, hip-hop, gymnastics, tap, lyrical, and ballet. The owner was one of her cousins, and she said that Xandra was the best hip-hop dancer she had ever seen. The name Xandra is a Spanish word for warrior, and that is the spirit this woman embodied. She was a natural at working with children. After years of participating in dance competitions, she was always thinking of new and exciting ways to choreograph dance routines. She was like a big sister to all the girls at the studio. Her coworker Stacy said that she admired Xandra so much. She said, "She's the most ambitious, passionate, and confident person I've ever been blessed to know. She was a genuinely loving, caring, and beautiful person." Xandra was extroverted and loved to network. When she was invited to a party, she was the first person there and the last person to leave. No matter how well she knew the host or not, by the end of the night, she would know everyone, and everyone would notice her. She was an entertainer. She performed in music videos and did line dancing at New York events. At 26, she was working with a producer in Atlanta, Georgia, to create demos for a music album. She had a talent for songwriting and a memorable, beautiful voice. Every Sunday, she sang in the Good News Gospel Choir and attributed all of her success to her faith. Zandra's music career was just starting to take off, and so was her acting. She was part of the Screen Actors Guild and had an agent in New York City who helped her land audition after audition. She took a train an hour to New York to audition for minor TV roles, and she finally ended up landing a gig on Law & Order. She was one of those single-episode characters that just stole the show. The Duxay family was so excited that Zandra had gotten the part, and knowing how dedicated she was, it was only a matter of time before she became famous. Everyone around her had no doubt about it. She was moving up in the world. She also had speaking roles in a couple of short films. One was called The Answering Machine, and another was called Introducing Zoe Harris. With all of this going on, Zandra really didn't have much time for romantic relationships. She dated Matt for 6 years, but after they parted ways in January of 2004, Zandra was back focusing on her work. They remained on good terms and would talk every now and again. Zandra didn't want the breakup to get in the way of her life or their friendship. Besides, a lot was going on in Zandra's household around the same time. Her parents, Linda and John, had separated, and John moved back to Orlando to be closer to his elderly mother. Zandra's brothers, Eric and Matthew, had moved out years ago. Eric was married to a woman named Stephanie, and they had 2 children together, while Matthew had moved nearby to Wellington. Zandra was still living at home with Linda, and as I had mentioned, she had the entire finished basement level to herself. Zandra could focus on all of her artistic endeavors without having to worry about rent. It was a very spacious area for Zandra to enjoy with friends. Right when you come down the stairs, there's a round table and chairs and a shelving unit where Zandra kept all of her trophies. They were lined up in a row, proudly on display. Further into this basement, there was a little workout area with a treadmill, as well as a sitting area that included a couch, and then a basement bedroom. It was the perfect place for Zandra and her big, lovable dog, Xena. She'd recently taken up piano and was also busy with her charities. She was such a giver. She devoted her life to helping other people. When she graduated college, she began an organization called Zandra's Kids, where she collected toys, clothing, and presents at Christmas time. She would wrap these gifts for children whose parents could not afford a Christmas. On Christmas Eve, she would load everything into a huge truck and then drive around, dropping off the presents to these families in person. More recently, Zandra was organizing a soup kitchen, where she hoped to turn it into an annual event. There were home videos of Zandra wrapping, packing, and happily distributing all of these gifts to underprivileged families in need. Things were going great in Zandra's life, but if they had kept going that way, we wouldn't be here discussing her death. Sadly, everything changed on May 19, 2006. It was a Friday, and Zandra met up with her best friend, Nicole Williamson, at the gym in Stratford called Bailey's Health and Fitness, about a 10-minute drive from her home. She and Nicole did a fitness class from 10:15 to about 11:15, and then they caught up on their plans for the rest of the day. Zandra told Nicole she was going to stay a little longer at the gym, then go home for lunch, get a facial, and that she had plans for the evening. Nicole left Zandra at the gym, where she worked out for another 30 minutes or so and then headed home. What Nicole didn't know was that this was the last time she would ever see her best friend alive. At 4 p.m., Nicole called Zandra with a question, but the phone went straight to voicemail. She wasn't concerned because Zandra always had her phone on her, but she didn't always pick up on the first try. She figured she would just call her back later that day. Zandra's mother left work and pulled into the driveway of their Booth Bay Street home at 4:30. As soon as she saw the house, she knew that something wasn't right. Zandra's white Mitsubishi 3000 GT was in the driveway, but the front gate of the house was wide open, and her dog Xena was sitting in the yard, just wagging her tail. For some reason, Xena had stayed in the yard, but she was unleashed. Xandra, being a responsible pet owner, would not have just left her dog out there, so this was very out of character for her. Linda went inside and began calling out Xandra's name, heading toward her basement-level bedroom. Linda walked down the narrow carpeted basement stairs into the dark room, and that is when she got the first sight that something was definitely not okay. To Linda's right was the stairs' wooden banister, and close to the ground were several red stains and droplets that looked like blood running down the wood paneling. Where the staircase ended, there was a right turn, where the table and chairs that I mentioned earlier were located. But before she even made it that far, Linda saw a bright red smear on the baseboards of the radiator at the bottom part of the wall in front of her. There was no question, that was blood. Her heart sank when she turned the sharp corner and saw Xandra's feet, wearing her white socks, and then her legs, wearing blue jeans and a white shirt. Xandra was lying on her back, right underneath the table, in a very odd position with her arms outstretched. Her top was pulled up a bit, showing her bra. Linda's first thought was that Xandra must have somehow fallen and hit her head on the radiator, which appeared to be broken. Linda called to her daughter again, but she didn't respond. That's when Linda took a closer look and realized that Xandra was lying in the middle of a very bloody scene. The room was covered in blood, and Xandra was lying on top of a large pool of it. This wasn't a fall, it was far worse. There was way too much blood for this to have been an accident. At first, Linda couldn't figure out what had happened. She said that her mind was split in two. One part of her saw her daughter, stiff as a board, her long hair caked in blood, and she knew she was dead. But then there was this other part of Linda that was in denial. She thought that maybe Xandra was just unconscious, that she had hit her head, and she was going to be okay. But again, as Linda got closer, that's when the next image of her daughter burned into her brain forever. Xandra was unrecognizable. Linda knew it was her daughter, but what she was staring at did not appear to be a human being. From the looks of the damage, Linda frantically called 911. Linda was just screaming into the phone, trying to describe what she was seeing in that moment. At first, it's just her screaming in horror, shock, and disbelief that her daughter is dead. She explains there's so much blood and tells the operator that her daughter's whole face is gone, her head is caved in, and she says, "My daughter is dead." It's absolutely terrifying, and I cannot imagine the pure fear and realization of what Linda was looking at. There are so many emotions going through a person when they witness such a horrific scene, especially involving someone they love. Someone had bludgeoned her daughter's face with so much force that her head was caved in, and she was no longer recognizable. The man on the other end of the phone asked Linda to hang on, and he got as much information as possible, including the address where they were located. The dispatcher contacted the fire department, and several members of the Milford Police Department, including officers Cable, Chacon, Free, and Braddock, came to the scene. When they arrived, Linda was outside hysterical, but she directed them to the basement. A fireman pronounced Xandra dead upon arrival. The damage inflicted on this woman was not compatible with human life. The officers immediately knew that Xandra had been murdered, that she was a homicide victim, and they called for backup. Detective Frank Gall came to the scene and photographed and videotaped everything. Sergeant Stephen Widra was put in charge of the homicide investigation, and the Connecticut State Police were also involved in processing all the evidence. This crime scene was intense. Sergeant Widra said that this was the worst crime scene he had witnessed in all 27 years of doing this. The officers found a young woman lying face up on the carpeted floor of the finished basement. The carpet had soaked up a large amount of blood. There was blood spatter all over the floor, an overturned chair on the left, and a wooden dresser to the right. On the dresser, where Xandra kept more than 24 trophies and ribbons that she had won, lined up in a perfect row, they were now covered with blood spatter. Just a glance at Xandra's face made it evident that she was hit with such tremendous force because one of her eyeballs had become dislodged from its socket. The officers were in shock. Officer Dennis Burke actually said her face was completely bashed in, and was unrecognizable as a human face. Xandra was taken to Farmington, Connecticut for an autopsy, and when she was being moved, the detective realized there was something beneath her head. They found the murder weapon, at least one of them. It was the blade of a small kitchen knife, and it was missing its handle. She had been struck with such force that the blade broke off of the knife. Investigators also found a weird chunk of plastic, and they weren't really sure of its significance at first. They were looking around, just doing a preliminary check of the surroundings, before they did a more thorough investigation. As they looked around, they noticed that many of the heavy trophies on that shelf had marble bases, but at the top, they were made of plastic. When they examined the shelf, they made a realization, which was later confirmed by Xandra's mother. One of the trophies was missing. They surmised that the blunt force trauma to Xandra's face had been caused by one of her own trophies, and in the struggle, a piece of that trophy had broken off. But the rest of the trophy and the knife handle were missing. They figured the killer must have taken these items with them. Detectives Wyra and Goal took the lead from here. They noticed that next to the pool of blood was a footprint. It wasn't very pronounced. It kind of looked like an oval and was foot-shaped, but unlike a shoe print, there weren't patterns indicating what kind of shoe it belonged to. It was larger in size, but they couldn't be sure of the exact measurements. These footprints were more like marks in a pattern that appeared to be someone walking through the scene in blood, but wearing shoes that didn't have soles with a design. They weren't really too sure what they were going to do here, because usually they would take some kind of impression and compare that to different shoes that maybe some suspects were wearing. But in this case, they really didn't have much to go on. Investigators found blood not only in the stairwell and the basement bedroom, but also in the first-floor bathroom. The blood stains were on the toilet seat and in the sink, but they were very faint, like they had been mixed with water. So they figured the perpetrator had gone upstairs and cleaned up as much evidence as they could. This blood, as well as the blood at the crime scene, was swabbed and sent to the state lab for DNA testing. They also dusted the bathroom for fingerprints and found one, only one, but they did find one. Because of the lack of prints, it was believed that the perpetrator was probably wearing gloves, which meant that this murder was premeditated. It was looking like this murder was also very personal. The fact that Xandra's face was destroyed the way it was as though her attacker had tried to erase her beauty, to take away what was unique and special about her, to essentially erase her identity. Our faces make us who we are. They are where our expressions are made. For someone to do this much damage, it pointed to a lot of rage and a personal motive. It's clear this person wanted Xandra gone, but this was overkill. From the knocked-over chair in the area, there had been a struggle, but it didn't start in the basement. The trail of blood was up the stairs as well, but the main part of the home didn't seem to have anything in disarray at all. The upstairs portion looked tidy. The kitchen, the dining room, and the living room all looked in order, and no blood appeared to be in these areas of the house. A purse was sitting on a chair near one of the doors, and items were neatly positioned on the living room coffee table. Even Xandra's basement bedroom seemed to be in order. However, her closet was another story. There seemed to be a laundry basket overturned, or maybe rummaged through, because there was clothing scattered on the floor in front of it. Something on her bed appeared to have been placed there after it was neatly made. Some of the laundry was beside the neatly made bed as well, but most of the blood and the items out of place were from the stairs leading into the basement and the dining area, with the table where Xandra was found underneath. There was blood on the lamp hanging over this table, and there was a significant amount of blood on the radiator, which was broken. It appeared to be the first place Xandra went down after she was initially struck on the stairs. It probably happened where those streaks of blood were. She was likely hit from behind as she walked down the stairs. Although there were clear signs of a violent struggle in the basement, Xandra's body did not appear to have been sexually violated, as she had all her clothing on. But of course, this would have to be confirmed at autopsy. Investigators did not find any damage to Xandra's front or back door. They wondered if the door had been unlocked, but that was unlikely. As Zandra's mom explained, she was responsible and always locked the door behind her. This led investigators to believe she might have known her attacker and let them inside her home. But why was none of the upstairs furniture overturned? This meant Zandra had either willingly gone to her bedroom with the perpetrator or been physically overpowered at some point between the front door and the door leading to the basement. There was also no sign of a robbery. Zandra's purse and wallet were still in the house. The only thing missing was her cell phone. Investigators assumed her phone may have been taken by the killer because it had key information that could lead detectives to who did this. While looking for Zandra's phone, Milford investigators found a couple more clues. First, Zandra kept a printout of over 100 phone numbers in her bedroom desk. It was kind of like an address book. It appeared to have been downloaded from her phone account online. So, even if they didn't have her phone, they had the number and name of everyone she knew. Second, none of the knives in the house matched the knife blade found at the scene, so the murderer had brought a knife with them. Third, garbage bags were missing from the house, so the perpetrator could have used these bags to clean up as much as they could. The fact that there wasn't a trail of blood leading back upstairs and out of one of the doors made the investigators think this attacker could have changed into new clothing inside the house, maybe putting all the blood-soaked clothing and items into one big garbage bag, or a few, before putting on fresh clothing again. This was another clue about how much planning could have gone into this. While investigators were on the scene, Zandra's best friend, Nicole, actually showed up. It was around 5 p.m., and Zandra's brother, Eric, also showed up around the same time. Everyone was a mess. Nicole was hysterical. She realized her best friend had been killed, and it was unbelievable. She had just seen her a few hours earlier that same day. Of course, investigators wanted to talk to everyone close to Zandra, including Linda and Nicole, the people who knew her best. By now, this quiet neighborhood was buzzing with police vehicles, and a perimeter was set with the oh-so-distinctive yellow crime scene tape. Everyone knew something terrible had happened, but the details were still unknown to the public. Law enforcement sat Linda down, and as much as she was overcome with sadness and disbelief, she wanted to help in any way she could. They asked her if she knew anyone who would want to harm her daughter, someone that may have a vendetta against her. But Linda didn't know who could do something so horrible. All of us have been in situations in life that cause us to be around others who become angry, but to lead to such a brutal murder? It was unclear. Overwhelmed with sorrow, Linda had to reach out to her son, Matt, to deliver the devastating news of his sister's murder. Matt was struck with disbelief. He couldn't believe she was dead. Nicole told the investigators that she'd been with Zandra that morning at their fitness class at 10:15 and had left around 11:15, but Zandra stayed behind. That was the last time she saw her. But Zandra had discussed her plans and told Nicole she was going home to shower, then get a facial before she went out with her boyfriend Jay for dinner. They had reserved a hotel room for that night so they could spend the night together. Nicole said she didn't know Jay's full name. She had no idea what Jay stood for and didn't know his last name either. As a matter of fact, she told detectives that Zandra had only been dating Jay for 2 weeks. Nicole didn't even know Jay, but she figured he must be pretty handsome and personable if he caught Zandra's attention. She was pretty picky. Of course, this raised suspicions right away. A new man in Zandra's life. Who was this guy? Could he be the one that attacked her? That was the first thing they were trying to figure out. Meanwhile, the detectives spread out and they were going door to door throughout the entire neighborhood, asking if anyone had seen anything strange on the quiet street earlier that day. When people found out that Zandra had been killed, they were shocked and scared. Milford had a low crime rate, and nobody thought this would happen in their neighborhood or that this would happen to someone like Zandra. Of course, this raised suspicions right away. A new man in Zandra's life. Who was this guy? Could he be the one that attacked her? That was the first thing they were trying to figure out. This also made her case get recognized on a national level. It didn't take long for the media to jump on the story. a young, beautiful, talented woman who was an actress and a dancer, and who appeared on a show about crime, had been murdered. The media were like vultures. They were everywhere. But going back to the neighbors, one of them said at 12:30 they had seen a red pickup truck driving down the street. Another neighbor said that around 4 p.m. they saw a black male walking down the street. He got into a dark-colored Acura, and both of these people were just making observations of things that stood out as maybe not the normal people or vehicles in the area. But nobody thought to actually take down a license plate or get a really good look at these people so that they could describe them. These were just things they recalled when they were asked if anything was out of the ordinary. A worker with the company called True Green Chemlon said that he walked by Xandra's house around 2:30 that afternoon, and he noticed a white car in the driveway that was Xandra's, and a dog sitting on the lawn, which was Xena. He also mentioned the wide-open gate, which is exactly what Linda saw when she arrived home as well. But if all of that had been the same since 2:30, it was likely that Xandra was already attacked or killed by that time, and this was very important for their timeline. Xandra was most likely home by noon, so it was really crucial to pin down the approximate time of her murder so they could find out who did this. Well, they had their first lead. It only took investigators about an hour to figure out who Jay was. He was Jermaine Morton. They were not able to get in touch with him at first, but contacted his sister, and she was able to provide additional information. She called Jay and told him he was wanted by authorities for questioning in Xandra's murder. When Jay arrived at the Milford Police Department, police noticed he was taken aback. He was nervous, but Jay told the police he had nothing to do with Xandra's murder. He was indeed her boyfriend. Back in May, he met her while she was at work at People's Bank. He and one of his guy friends came in together, and when Jay saw Xandra, he told his friend he thought she was really beautiful. So, his friend approached Xandra and relayed this message to her, that his friend thought she was beautiful and wanted him to give his number to her. At that point, he gave Xandra Jay's number. Xandra was flattered. She actually thought Jay was pretty cute, and she called the number. That night, they got to talking and decided to set up their first date, which turned into several. Jermaine Morton, who went by Jay, was a couple of years older, and he worked at a company called Etron. He went around town checking the electric and gas meters of people's homes, and he was currently living with his mother because he had just moved his things out of his ex-girlfriend's house. He was in an on-and-off-again relationship with his ex, but when he met Xandra, they were in an off phase, and Jay was ready to dive into a new romance. Things moved very quickly between the new couple, and Xandra had recently told her mom that she had a new boyfriend, so she put that label on their relationship. But she did say they were still trying to figure out their feelings, and they were kind of riding high in the honeymoon phase. Linda was, of course, happy for her daughter. After that 6-year relationship with Matt, she knew that Xandra deserved someone who she was really, truly connected with. So as Jay explained what he did that day, he told the detectives he called Xandra around noon to figure out their plans for that night. They were having a normal conversation, but then at around 12:20, Xandra told Jay to hold on. It seemed as though she had maybe heard or seen something. Then she told Jay that her ex-boyfriend was outside. There was a pause as Jay could hear what sounded like Xandra opening the front door. And then Jay heard Xandra say, "What are you doing here? You were supposed to call first." Jay hadn't heard a knock. He didn't hear an answer from whoever this ex-boyfriend was. But Xandra then came back on the phone and told Jay she'd have to call him right back. So someone did come over, and it seemed like Xandra let them inside, or at the very least, she opened the door. So was this the last time Jay heard from Xandra? No. About 15 minutes later, when Jay hadn't heard back from Xandra, he got concerned and he called her. She picked up, and Jay said they talked from about 12:34 to 12:37, and Xandra didn't bring up the interruption who had been at her door. Nothing. Jay said they had a very uneventful conversation, and he agreed to call back when he got off work. Everything was still planned for that night, but of course, their date never happened because Xandra was killed. This narrowed the timeline down even more. Xandra must have been murdered sometime between 12:37 when she hung up with Jay and 4:30 when her mom got home. But factoring in that person who saw the wide-open gate and the dog on the lawn at 2:30, it was probably closer to that 2:30 to 4:30 time frame. So where was Jay? Was he really at work? When did he go in? Did he have an alibi? Well, he said he did. He told investigators that he had been working between 7 a.m. and 3 p.m., just driving around town checking the utility meters. Jay had a black Honda, and that's similar to what that one neighbor reported seeing around 4:30. Remember, Jay said he called Xandra all day long after that initial phone call. He said he called at 1:30, 2 o'clock, but Xandra wasn't picking up. Jay said that when he finally got off work, he went to Jimmy's Army and Navy store in West Haven. This is a clothing store. It's known for camo pants, things like that. He said he was there to pick out an outfit for their date that evening. Then he said he went back to his mom's house, where he was living, and around 4:30, he called Xandra, and then he drove to her house to check on her, since she had still not gotten in touch. Jay told the investigators that when he pulled up around 5 o'clock and saw the police cars and the crime scene tape, he freaked out and just left. He didn't stop and talk to an officer. He didn't get out and find out what was going on. That his girlfriend was answering her phone, he just went back to his mom's, turned on the news to try to see if there was any information about what had happened at Xandra's house, and if she was okay. That sounded really odd to the authorities. He was checking on her, but then when he realized she might have been hurt, he just left. It seemed kind of suspicious, but it was also interesting to learn that Jay was in an on-again, off-again relationship with another woman before meeting Xandra. So, was this woman jealous about what was going on between Jay and this new girl? Jay left the interview as a suspect, but before looking into more of him and his connections, investigators wanted to know who Xandra's ex-boyfriend was. Both Nicole and Linda confirmed Xandra only had one ex-boyfriend, the guy she dated when she was in her teens, Matt Pugh, but they hadn't been together for quite a while. Also, when Jay called back, Xandra picked up. Remember, she was fine. There was no evidence connecting this ex-boyfriend at the door to her being killed. So was Jay trying to maybe mislead the police? Well, they decided to file for background checks and a search warrant for Jay's phone and waited a few days for the request to go through. Linda explained that Xandra and Matt had been together for 6 years, but the breakup was less than friendly. She was so happy that Xandra had met someone new, someone that 1, didn't have a criminal record, and 2, appreciated Xandra, her positivity, her beauty, and her kindness. That's interesting. Was she implying that her ex Matt did have a criminal record and didn't treat her well? Linda told them that Xandra had known Matt since they were in high school, and soon they began calling each other girlfriend and boyfriend. And the couple was on and off over the years, until Matt actually went to prison in 1998 for selling narcotics. While many people would have walked away from the situation, Xandra stood by him. She visited him every week, but Matt wasn't getting out anytime soon. Even though Xandra was very patient, she wanted her own life. She was independently moving into a new phase, and though she loved Matt, she realized she had to move on. So through all those years, she stayed committed to Matt, and her friends could not understand why. It was like she thought that she could change him. She truly did like to help people. She saw the good in people, and she saw the good in him. She would send him letters on a regular basis, but by January of 2004, Xandra and Matt broke up. This was because Matt could tell there was a distance growing between them, and he began to write pretty mean things to Xandra, things that she was no longer comfortable with. But that was 2 years ago. Still, it was a lead, so they went with it. This was still on the first day of the investigation, the day Xandra was found dead. Detective Widra assigned Dr. Huggins and Detective Ron to track down Matt. They found out he was living with his wife, Sharice Trotman, at 98 North Street in Hayman, Connecticut. It was about a 30-minute drive northeast of Milford. That evening, Matt was working a part-time job in New Haven at Papa John's on Bow Avenue. When the detectives finally found him, they had a 15-minute conversation out in the back of the restaurant. Matt said he worked 2 jobs. His other job was at an airplane parts manufacturing company in Windsor, which is about an hour north of Milford. It was called Chrome Alloy Aviation. They repair, design, engineer, and manufacture gas turbine engine parts for aircraft, and that was part of their manufacturing team. He said he worked from 6:30 in the morning to 3 p.m. that day, and then he went home, filled up on gas, went to the bank to deposit a check, and then he'd been at Papa John's ever since. Huggins and Ron asked Matt the last time he had talked to or seen Alexandra, and to their surprise, Matt admitted that they had spoken on the phone just a couple of days ago. But the last time Matt saw her in person was about 4 weeks before this. However, his wife wouldn't be so thrilled to know he was still in contact with his ex. That's when Huggins and Ron told Matt that Xandra was dead, and Matt didn't give that much of a reaction. The police didn't trust Matt, and Matt, having been in prison, didn't trust the police. So what was an expected reaction to this news? After this initial conversation, Matt went back to the station and he spoke with Sergeant Douglas Oud. He made a statement. Sergeant Oud asked Matt about his alibi, and this time he admitted that he had not been at work all day, like he initially said. Remember, he said he got there at 6:30 in the morning and left at 3 o'clock. No, he said that at 9:15 that morning he got a really bad feeling about his 17-year-old stepdaughter, Shamira Troden Adams. He thought that maybe she was inviting a boy over because she had been suspended from high school 2 days before this, and she was home alone while both parents were at work. So, Matt had this really uneasy feeling, and he wanted to stop and check in on his stepdaughter. So, he lied to his boss. He told him his daughter had been suspended and he needed to go take care of things at the school. A supervisor allowed Matt to leave. Matt said at this point he drove to Hampton and got there about 9:50. Shamira was still asleep, so Matt did a little workout. He lifted weights in his at-home gym from about 10:05 to 11:15. At around noon, he said he purchased $15 of gas at the Hammond H station. Then, Matt drove in the direction of Stratford to explore used car dealerships. He explained that his stepdaughter had just learned to drive and he wanted to get her a car. Matt told the investigators he went to at least 5 different dealerships. He stopped at one around 12:15, another one at 12:40, and at 1:15 until he got hungry at around 2:40 that afternoon. He was still in Stratford, and he called his wife to see if maybe she wanted to get a late lunch. Charisse worked as a teacher, and teachers don't usually get lunch hours, so this struck Detective Oud as a little strange. But Matt said Charisse never even picked up the phone anyway, so Matt just drove through the McDonald's drive-thru alone. To be fair, it was already almost 3 p.m. when Matt reached out to Charisse, and remember he said it was a late lunch. Most schools get out around 2:45, so I really didn't think it was that strange. After that, Matt said he went to Papa John's. He picked up a paycheck, he dropped it off at the bank, and was home between the hours of 4 o'clock and 4:25. Then, he drove to Papa John's for his evening shift. From the sound of it, it seems like all of his hours of the day are accounted for. When it came to his friendship with his ex, Xandra, who is now deceased, Matt said that they were on good terms. They had both moved on from their relationship. He loved his wife and his daughters, Shamira, and his new baby girl, Shahseed, and he would not do anything to sacrifice his current situation with his wife and his new life. Matt said he wasn't in Milford that day. There would have been no reason for him to be anywhere near Xandra's house. He gave investigators his t-shirt and consented to DNA samples. So why had Matt lied the first time he talked to them when he said he was at work all day? Detective Oud wasn't sure, but Matt's alibi seemed solid. I mean, maybe he didn't want to explain everything to his boss. Maybe he thought his stepdaughter was letting boys in the house, and he just made it simple. But a lie is a lie, especially when it comes to detectives looking into your alibi. But they did let him go at this point, and they requested search warrants for Matt's house and car. Meanwhile, Chief Medical Examiner Ira Serre was in charge of conducting Xandra's autopsy. Xandra's manner of death was homicide, and her cause of death was determined to be multiple sharp and blunt force injuries to her head, causing craniocerebral trauma. She also sustained a number of sharp and blunt wounds to her neck and torso. The sharp wounds were inflicted by the blade of a knife. She had stab wounds to her face, torso, neck, and the back of her head. She was attacked with a blunt object that was much larger than a knife handle, something like a trophy, as the investigators had initially thought, or even something like a baseball bat. This is so horrific, but to truly convey how angry and violent the killer was, I told you that Xandra had been hit with such force she was missing one of her eyes. She was hit so hard that there were also several of her teeth that had gone down her throat and were found in her stomach. On one of Xandra's hands was a very fine, thin hair stuck to dried blood, and it did not appear to have come from someone African American. Instead, it looked like it belonged to someone that was white. Xandra was blonde at this point because she had gotten her hair highlighted, and she had naturally coarse hair that kind of had some waviness to it. So they weren't sure if this hair came from her own head, so it was a possibility that this belonged to the perpetrator. This was sent to the crime lab for DNA processing. Both Jermaine and Matt were black males, so if this was the killer's hair, maybe her attacker was somebody else. Found on Xandra's left cheek was a 1.5-inch wide piece of black electrical tape, and when it was removed from her face, there was no blood underneath, which means that it had been taped there before she was injured. At first, this was kind of strange. It was kind of a small piece of tape, but Dr. Camper determined that the tape had actually ripped off of a larger piece. So it was as though the killer had wound this electrical tape around her mouth and gagged her to stop her from screaming. When they removed the tape after her death, they hadn't gotten all of it, so that part was left behind. Police sent the tape in for testing and searched Linda's home for similar tape, but they did not find a matching roll, so it stands to reason the attacker brought it with them. As for Xandra's mother, Linda, her brother Eric, Matthew, and her father John, they suffered knowing that the killer was still out there and what Xandra went through. After they were told everything that the investigators knew, Xandra's family actually suspected Matt could have done this, but they wanted the case to be proven through the justice system. John believed his daughter was probably beaten with a bat. He made several statements saying he wished Connecticut had the death penalty so that this murderer could get a taste of their own medicine. They were in the dark for such a long time, and that's part of the investigative process for cases like this. Xandra's funeral visitation was on Wednesday, May 24th in Milford, with a mass held at Christ the Redeemer Church. It was a very moving ceremony, and all of her extended family came to celebrate her life. Xandra's brother Matt was moved to see just how many people's lives Xandra had touched through her passion for dance, her auditioning, and her involvement in various charitable causes. It was quite a testament to her vibrant spirit and the impact that she had on those around her. People from all corners of her life came together, traveling far and wide to say their goodbyes and share their memories. This outpouring of love and support provided a sense of solace for Xandra's family as they navigated the rough waters of grief. They were witnessing how deeply Xandra was cherished and how her presence had left a mark on so many hearts. It was bittersweet comfort, though. They still wanted to find out who did this. The detectives working on Xandra's murder case actually went to these funeral services because they were hoping to see somebody acting suspiciously that might lead them to the killer. Jay attended, but her ex, Matt, didn't come, and investigators still didn't know if either one of them was responsible. As all of this was unfolding, investigators were looking into both of these men. First, they found out that just like Matt, Jay did have a criminal record. He had been arrested for becoming physically violent with his on and off again ex. So was this cycle repeating itself? Recall he had a black Honda Accord with gold rims. Could that be confused with an Acura? Sure. This matched the description of the black man entering a black Acura at 4 p.m. Matt had been in prison for over 5 years after selling drugs, and he had a dark green Acura with chrome detailing that could also match the description given by the neighbor. It was actually an Acura, and then another neighbor came forward with a tip. His name was Michael Shako. He was a high school student who lived right near Linda's house, and he said he saw a dark green Honda Accord with gold rims outside the house all day. He couldn't remember the race of the driver, but this description put Jay in the spotlight. So again, we have a similar description of a car, or maybe both men were involved, but this was also a very popular model and color of a vehicle. they had to continue narrowing things down. Investigators went to Jay's boss, his name was John Durdall, and they wanted to confirm his alibi. John said that Jay punched in at 6:30. A man punched out at 2:45. This was the new boyfriend. He had driven all over Bridgeport and Fairfield all day checking utility meters on houses, and he said he hadn't gone anywhere near Milford. Then they went to Jimmy's Army and Navy store. Remember that? They asked for the security footage and started looking at the tape after Jay said he got a fork at 2:45, but there was no footage showing he was there. However, when they rewound the tape to 1 p.m., there he was. He was checking out, wearing a pink button-down shirt at 1:15. This was a different story. He was actually shopping on the job. So did that mean he was doing anything else on the job? Finally, investigators were granted access to Jay's phone, and that is where the trail went cold. Jay had called people all day, including Xandra, but none of the calls pinged off a Milford cell tower until well after 4 p.m. And we know at that point he was on his way over there, so he was ruled out as a suspect at that time. Detective Widra spent a few days trying to confirm Matt's alibi on the day of the 19th. So, Wyra went to Chrome Alloy himself to talk to Matt's boss, Robert Jones. He said that Matt hadn't clocked out at 9:15. He clocked out at 8:39 a.m. And when they went to the Hess gas station, it turns out Matt was there, but not at 12 p. like he claimed. He was seen on surveillance footage at 2:10 p.m., so where was he between those hours? Wyra sent a team to various car dealerships that Matt said he visited, and not a single person remembered seeing Matt at the dealerships. When they checked footage at the bank, sure enough, they saw Matt on camera. He had been there just before 4 p.m., so he was being honest about that. However, his alibi was quite a mess, and they were poking holes left and right. At this point, Wyra did not have search warrants yet, so he met Matt outside of his house. Wyra asked Matt to come with him and give him a full tour of all the car dealerships he said he went to that day, but Matt said, "I don't have to do that." "Yeah, that's right, you don't have to." But this was Xandra's friend, her ex, someone that cared about her, so the detective just thought that was weird, and he was convinced that Matt was the killer. He just had to prove it. Luckily, the search warrant went through on May 26th, a week after the murder. When Widra showed up, Matt wasn't home, but Charisse and Shamara were there, along with Matt's cousin, Anthony Pugh. Anthony said that he and Matt worked together at Chrome Alloy and commuted in the same car every day, so they spent a lot of time together. The police decided to ask Anthony if he knew anything about Xandra's death, but Anthony said that he didn't and insisted Matt was innocent. Matt's wife, Charisse Troutman's home was squeaky clean. All the clothes were folded, all the surfaces were spotless, and there was no sign of blood anywhere. But the police did find 3 things in the kitchen at the computer workstation. They found a roll of 1.5-inch wide black electrical tape. And in the inner label, the brand wasn't the usual ones that we're used to seeing. It wasn't 3M or Uline, it wasn't even duct tape, it was called Permacell. It's a heavy-duty double-sided tape that's used for a variety of purposes, including holding pieces of metal in place during machining. It was black, so it stood out since the tape found on Xandra's face was also black, and none was found at her house. Also in the kitchen at Matt and Chessa's place, they found a lint roller, just like the ones you'd use to remove pet hair. It was wound with black tape, so that was strange. Then, in the basement, inside a garbage can right next to the washing machine, was more tape. It was in an overlapping spiral and had been folded in half and thrown in the garbage. So they collected all of these wads of tape for DNA processing. Police also searched Matt's car, but they didn't find anything. No fingerprints, no DNA, nothing of significance. But after examining this tape, an expert said it was a special kind of tape. It wasn't distributed in any Connecticut retail stores. Permacell Model P34 was created by New London Tape Distributors, and it had a unique adhesive backing that they made only in the Northeast. In 2006, the tape was used by only 3 companies: AdCam Incorporated in Manchester, Connecticut, Grandstone Incorporated in Westerly, Rhode Island, and Chrome Alloy Aviation in Windsor, where Matt works. So I guess it wouldn't be that odd for Matt to have this tape in his possession. But was it the same tape on Xandra's face? Well, unfortunately, It wasn't that easy to match two pieces of tape perfectly. However, they did share the same color, texture, tight backing, and appeared to have the same type of adhesive. Nobody could get tape like this from Home Depot. Unfortunately, there were knockoff tapes that were out there on the market, and they were used in manufacturing companies, so it wasn't a perfect match. They couldn't tell, but they were similar tape, but that was that. So ultimately, no concrete conclusion. Detective Widra did wonder, was Matt responsible for this incriminating evidence? Or did Matt's cousin Anthony have access to the tape and maybe try to pin this murder on his cousin? Because it didn't make that much sense. Why would Matt keep tape in garbage cans and around his kitchen if he had used it in a murder? You'd think that he would get rid of it. So, on June 1st of 2006, they decided to interview Matt's cousin Anthony. That's when Anthony realized that he might become a suspect in this crime. He told them that Matt had a really short fuse. He could get mad really easily and fly off the handle. He even had a motive against Xandra. Of course, detectives' ears perked up. They wanted to hear more. He tells the investigators that apparently Matt had gifted his car, a Nissan, to Alexandra in 2002. He also loaned her $220,000 in 2003. And then when January 2004 came around, she broke up with him and kept the car and the money. So, Matt had tried to buy her love, and when he didn't get what he wanted back, he wanted to get revenge. This is all according to Anthony, but this was news to the cops. On June 14th, they re-interviewed Matt. They hoped to clarify the inconsistencies in his story, because remember, he said his relationship was fine with Xandra. But first, they wanted to question him about stopping at those car dealerships. Matt said that when he did, he never talked to any of the salespeople. It was kind of damp outside that day from the rain, so none of the salespeople were actually outside. Matt explained he wasn't serious enough about buying a car that day, so he didn't go inside to try to talk to anyone, and he didn't want anyone trying to sell him on anything. Still, nobody could confirm that Matt was at any of these dealerships. So the detective asked him about the money that he supposedly gave Xandra. Matt said he might have given her maybe $4,000 that she didn't pay back, but it was never $220,000. He said that was outrageous. He also explained that she had his Nissan for a while, and she bought it from his dad while he was in jail, but he never knew what happened to it. At this point, Matt did not cooperate any further. He didn't feel like he had the need to do so because he insisted he wasn't involved. But soon enough, they would have more evidence. DNA processing always takes forever, but the results came back before the end of the year. All of the blood droplets in Linda's basement actually belonged to Xandra. However, when they swabbed the first-floor bathroom, remember that blood they found at the toilet and the sink that was watered down? That was a mixture of Xandra's DNA and DNA from a male contributor. Two types of blood analysis kits were used. One was called the Identifiler kit, and the other was called a Powerplex Y kit. Both were used to determine that both blood spots the Y chromosome, which only men have. In one of the samples, 25% of black men could be a contributor, and for the other, the odds were 1 in 2,800 that it was a black male with Matt's blood type. So basically, Jay and Matt could both potentially have been the killer, according to these blood results, but it was leaning more toward Matt. However, these results were inconclusive. I'm sure you can tell it wasn't very specific about whose DNA it was. There was no DNA belonging to Xandra on the roll of tape or the weighted tape that was found at Matt's home. The blonde hair in her hand remained unidentified, and the fingerprint, the only one found on the scene, didn't match up with anyone in the system or anyone the police had tested. And remember that footprint? The one that was just an oval shape and didn't have any features? Well, that was that. Nothing could really be determined. Sergeant Widra and Sergeant Braddock were shocked by how little evidence was left behind, and they still hadn't even found the murder weapon or Z's cell phone. Nobody would talk, and the trail went cold. Years went by, and that's what no one ever likes to hear about these cases. Over the next few years, Widra had Xandra's photograph pinned to his desk. He thought about her every single day. Her father, John, and brother Eric wrote to the governor at the time and other elected officials to ask the state to post a tip reward. After 2 years, the cold case unit got involved, and a man named Kevin Lawler, a state prosecutor, helped out with this case. He sent a petition to the governor, and she agreed to offer a $50,000 reward to anyone with information that could lead to an arrest. For 3 whole years, barely anyone answered the call for tips. Eric was so confused and upset. Zandra's case had received a decent amount of press in the media in the first few months, but now it just looked like everyone had moved on. He did not want Zandra to be forgotten, so her family took matters into their own hands. They decided to use their own resources to raise awareness about her case and to encourage someone to come forward with information. They used their hard-earned money and put up billboards. They put them in strategic locations where Zandra was known to frequent, and these billboards served as a constant reminder of the tragedy that happened to her. The hope was that someone passing by would see a billboard, recognize Zandra's face, and remember something, just some critical clue that could aid in this investigation. Month after month, her family just yearned for just one phone call, just one tip that could break open this case, but nothing came in. In 2010, the Duxace and the bank where Zandra had worked did a holiday drive in Zandra's memory, and the family came together to grieve. They made 200 dinners that were distributed at Cornerstone Christian Church and the Bridgeport School District. At the event, everyone talked about Zandra's charity, Zandra's kids, her love for children, and her hard work and dedication to making deep connections with people in need. Meanwhile, Kevin Lair was set on solving this case, so he decided to reach out to a part of the population that would not have heard about the reward. Inmates, people in prison. They play a lot of card games, and there are these things called cold case cards. They are card decks that print pictures of missing people or murdered people, along with a brief bio and the reward money on each card. Zandra's photo appeared on the 2 of clubs. I'm going to put it up on the screen. These cards were passed out throughout the Connecticut Department of Corrections. In September of 2011, the Milford Police Department received a call from an inmate named Paul O'Connell, and this was a big break. Paul said that his fellow inmate, Christopher Richards, had actually dated Zandra 2 years before she was murdered. The 2 of them, Chris and Zandra, had actually met at the prison while she was visiting Matt. He said that when Zandra broke up with Matt, she got with Chris, and then she broke up with Chris. He was enraged. He told Paul he would kill her. Paul said he was hanging out with Christopher and his sister Shannon when Shannon confirmed that Chris had murdered Zandra. He had just gotten out of prison at the time and returned home covered in blood. Police were shocked. How could this guy have slipped through the cracks? They asked Paul if anyone else knew the story, and he said he hadn't told a soul. Well, actually, that wasn't true. He had told his girlfriend, Crystal. So the police interviewed her, and she said that she and Paul were no longer together because he was a pathological liar. Crystal told him she didn't know anyone named Christopher, and that Paul was probably making all of the story up for attention, and of course, the $5,000. Then police interviewed Linda, Eric, Matthew, and Nicole just to make sure, and they had never heard of anyone named Paul. They knew that Zandra had not dated someone named Christopher. Zandra's only partners, they reiterated, were Matt and Jay. Eric was frustrated. It had been 5 years at this point, and he told the Connecticut Post that the police hadn't communicated with them as much as they wanted. They would just keep telling them to be patient and that they were trying. But it gets harder and harder as the years go by. Only 2 weeks after Paul's fake confession, on September 27th, a man named Jeremy Schneer came forward. Jeremy was a bus driver from Bridgeport who was church friends with Zandra. He said that in April, before she was murdered, Zandra invited him to hang out and discuss some songwriting. She picked him up in her Mitsubishi, and they drove to Dunkin' Donuts. In the parking lot, that's when her phone dinged, and she had received a scary text message from a guy named Donovan. According to Jeremy, this text said that if Zandra didn't pay back money that she owed him, he would kill her. As they got to talking in Jeremy's story, he tells them that Donovan Campbell was described by Zandra as a Jamaican gang member who lived out in New York. He was some kind of loan shark, and she had borrowed $1,000 to pay for her car. She still owed him $6,000. Despite Donovan's threat to take Zandra's life, she seemed unbothered by it. She and Jeremy just went back to their conversation, and that was that. He made sure to say that he knew Zandra kept these parts of her life very private. Well, with this new lead, police looked into this Donovan Campbell out in New York, but there was no record of him. They also looked at Zandra's bank records. And guess what? This woman had her life together. She worked at a bank. Let's not forget, she never would take a loan from a random guy. She didn't have to do that. In October of 2002, Zandra paid Thomas Pugh, who was Matt's father, $2,000 to buy Matt's Nissan, just like Matt had said. He sold her the car, and in March of 2004, she bought the white Mitsubishi for $12,000. The title was in her name. She paid off the entire car, and she had total savings in her account of $37,000 at the time of her death. This was her hard-earned money. It hadn't been a gift from Matt, like Anthony said. Zandra wasn't wrapped up in some dangerous activities with loan sharks. Just all lies. So once again, they reached a dead end. It just seemed like people wanted to collect this reward. But after 6 long years, a glimmer of hope emerged. In August of 2012, detectives received a valuable tip from a person they had spoken to once before. It was none other than Anthony Pugh, Matt's cousin. You know how they say the third time's a charm? Well, Anthony said he was tired of being harassed by the police. He had just gotten out of prison, and he was ready to finally come clean. He said he knew something about Zandra's murder, but he didn't come forward sooner because he didn't want to rat anyone out. But after seeking guidance from his wife and his pastor, he realized he needed to do the right thing and share what he knew. He began by explaining that back in 1993, Matt made Anthony part of his drug-dealing business. Anthony respected his cousin even though selling narcotics was dangerous, and both of them went to jail. He still trusted him. Finally, in 2005 to 2006, they were both free. They were out of prison, out of jail, and they landed jobs at Chrome Alloy. They loved it. He said they worked together 7 days a week, and they would even clock each other in to get more money. They loved luxury things. Gold chains, nice cars, expensive shoes, and making money. That was the lifestyle for both of them. But then they had a falling out. There was a police raid in New Haven, and Anthony was arrested again. This time, Anthony blamed Matt for leading him into this lifestyle and getting him arrested. Anthony wanted revenge, and this was his chance. He said that back when Matt was still doing his time and he was still dating Zandra, things started to get really nasty between them on Matt's part. Remember I mentioned that they used to exchange letters? Well, the letters stopped coming as frequently, and Matt suspected that Zandra had moved on. Ultimately, it was true, and Matt wasn't happy. Well, according to Anthony, who had already told other stories in 2005, he said that after Matt's release, he resented Zandra for breaking up with him, and frankly, he became obsessed with her. He said he would go to Linda's house at least once a week and sit outside in his car, watching Zandra, trying to figure out her day-to-day routine and who the people in her inner circle were. Matt told Anthony he planned to kill Zandra, and not only did he have a plan, he said he had what he called a foolproof plan, one that would never get him caught. He told Anthony he was going to inject her with drugs and make her death look like an overdose. Even more specifically, Matt planned to use items he got from Chrome Alloy, so he stole things like paper smocks, paper booties, and gloves. He stole 2 of everything so that he could layer up wearing them when he committed this crime, thus preventing his DNA from getting on the crime scene. Matt said that he would shave his entire body, all of his hair off the day before, including his head, so there would be no evidence left behind and the police would never find him. But he stole something else. Black permacell tape. Yep, everything was adding up, especially the tape. But recall the bloody footprint. Well, it didn't have a distinctive sole, and it wouldn't, if, like Anthony claimed, Matt covered it with a paper bootie. The lack of fingerprints could of course come from him wearing gloves. But what if Anthony committed the crime to get back at Matt and pinned it on him? It definitely crossed the detectives' minds. Anthony had a motive, and when police asked him why he was ratting out his cousin now, Anthony said plain and simple, he wanted that $50,000. But we've seen this before with the inmates and the bus driver, so was this even true? This information from Anthony was not enough to arrest Matt, but apparently it was enough probable cause to search Matt's phone records for the day of Zandra's murder. I was thinking, wouldn't they have done that already? Did they really not have enough probable cause? Did they even need it? I always thought that they could see those records and pull them no matter what, so I was a little surprised it took that long, but this was a long time ago. Well, as he traveled around the city that day, his phone pinged to a bunch of Sprint towers every time he made an outgoing call or received an incoming message. So at 6:47 and 6:48, he was in Wyson, Connecticut, at Chome Alloy. At 9:04 p.m., he's in Rocky Hill, heading back home. At 9:15 a.m., he's in Wallingford, very close to his home. Then there's a long period of silence, but then, at 11:47 a.m., Matt is in Milford. What he's lying about is that he said he wasn't in Milford at any time that day. But at 11:49, he's in Stratford. At 12:07, guess where he is again? Back in Milford. And at 1:09 p.m., he's still there. Then at 2:18, he's at the Hess gas station near Hamden, and at 2:19, he's back in Wallingford. He was in Milford twice, and one of those times he was there for over an hour, at the exact time that Zandra was home, between 12:07 and 1:09. This matches up with what Jay had initially reported, that an ex-boyfriend came around to Zandra's house that afternoon. That's telling. But let me get more specific. At 12:07, he left a voicemail for his wife, Charisse. At 1:09, she was calling him back, but he didn't pick up, and she left a 19-second voicemail. Matt did not check his phone until 2:18, which means he was preoccupied with something between 12:10 and 2:18. There weren't many car dealerships in Milford, and he hadn't been at the gas station at noon. So where was he? The phone records show that Matt had not called Zandra any time on May 19th, but back on May 16th, he called her 5 separate times in 25 minutes. That can be seen as excessive. 6 hours later, at 7:50, Zandra called and left Matt a voicemail on the 18th, the day before the murder. This man called her 4 times between 3:21 and 3:24, and 4 hours later, Zandra finally called him back. They had a 4-minute conversation. Matt had claimed in his initial statement that he called her 2 days before the murder, but actually he had been calling her the day before. What did they talk about? These records show that on the 16th, when Zandra was currently on the phone with her new boyfriend, Jay, she ended that conversation to talk to her ex-boyfriend, the one who shouldn't have been anywhere near her house on the day of the murder, but was. What were the odds that Matt would show up at 12:20, hoping to catch her off guard? The odds are pretty high, especially if it's true that he was watching her movements day in and day out. On August 24th of 2012, 6 years after Zandra was brutally murdered, her ex-boyfriend Matthew Pugh was arrested for first-degree murder and first-degree burglary. But he was already in jail. He had been at the Gardner Correctional Facility since July 15, 2010, for yet another case. Because back in August of 2008, 2 years after Zandra's murder, a woman named Tatiana Gorenko was walking down Andrew Street in New Haven when she was attacked. It was 8 p.m., and it was still light outside. This man that attacked her was described as around 5 feet 11 inches, 25 years old, a black male with a medium complexion, wearing cornrows. He stole her bag at gunpoint, and when Tatiana tried to rip the bag from his grasp, you know what he did? He shot her. He shot her right in the hand with his pistol. This was a residential street. The shot rang out, and he ran in the other direction with her bag, thinking that no one had noticed him. But people did notice. A woman across the street named Stephanie thought that she heard fireworks and a scream. When she looked outside, that's when she saw the robber. She said he was wearing black, loose-fitting clothes and a black hat. He had broad shoulders and a muscular build, but she couldn't see his face. Another woman named Christine Mingo was in the passenger seat of a car, and she said she saw a black male running, carrying a bag like a football and wearing baggy clothes with a medium complexion. He was wearing a do-rag. The police struggled to find the perpetrator. There were so many conflicting descriptions, and eyewitness testimony is very inconsistent and not always reliable. Tatiana's credit card was used at a supermarket and declined at Burlington Coat Factory. So police went and checked out the surveillance camera, and they found a woman using the card with 3 other people. The woman's name was Latricia Black, and she was brought in for questioning. She said she, Joanne, and Joanne's 2 friends were driving around all day. It was her first time meeting the driver, and his name was Matt. Police identified this man as Matthew Pugh from the surveillance footage. That week, the New Haven Police Department dismantled their robbery division. The officers got laid off, and this file was put in a drawer. It wasn't touched for 2 whole years. When someone finally found the file, they put out a warrant for Matt's arrest, and they arrested him in his new job working for Connecticut distributors. Now, Matt had charges of robbery, first-degree murder, assault in the first degree, and carrying a pistol without a permit, on top of his murder and burglary charges. The state of Connecticut says you can't arrest someone for burglary 5 years after it occurred, so the charge should not have happened. The police had no way to prove that Xandra didn't let him inside the home, but murder was enough, and Matt's bail was set at $2 million. Matt pleaded not guilty. He said Linda just didn't like him, so he would never go visit Xandra outside of her house. Plus, he already stated in his initial interview that he wouldn't have risked his marriage, so he wouldn't have been anywhere around Xandra's place. But soon, all of Matt's secrets would be revealed. Let me tell you what investigators dug up. Matt was born on June 19, 1972, and moved out of his parents' house when he was just 14. Other than his drug-dealing career, he held various jobs. He did forklift operations, he was a shoe salesman, a limo driver, and a fish market merchant. In 1996, 23-year-old Matt went into an Army-Navy clothing store, and he said he saw the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen. He was dating 3 other ladies at the time, but he had to have this one. That was Xandra. Matt claims that Xandra told him she was 20, but she was actually only 16. Where I live here in California, a 16-year-old dating a 23-year-old is a felony, but the age of consent in Connecticut is 16. Linda felt like Matt had taken advantage of her daughter, but at the time, Xandra was smitten. She thought he was such a sweetheart. Matt said Xandra knew that he had other girlfriends, but can we believe anything this man says? When Xandra invited Matt to her junior prom, he completely stood her up, and Xandra was devastated. Linda said this was the first sign of this man's manipulation. Unfortunately, Xandra wouldn't reveal too much to other people about her relationship, and Linda had only met Matt one time. Xandra really liked the idea of things being mysterious, having this secret romance. She thought Matt was handsome and cool, and he would protect her. But sadly, so many of us have seen this scenario play out over and over again, where a man will prey on a younger woman. While the age gaps are fine when you're older, your brain is still developing when you're younger, and it's so easy to be blinded by infatuation. Matt had several children with other women. He had a criminal history. And when Xandra started college, he went to jail. Xandra kept in touch with him, and they would collect calls every single day. Matt hung up all of her pictures and his letters on his wall in his cell. He told everyone about her, and he became completely obsessed. But if you recall, Xandra wanted some space. She didn't see this relationship continuing much longer. She was actually becoming scared of Matt. He just kept calling her, and he wouldn't take no for an answer. Xandra started to realize that this relationship was toxic, and she needed to focus entirely on herself and her career. Linda called Matt's time in prison a godsend. Without Matt's presence, Xandra's career was finally coming together. She was getting acting and dancing gigs, and she graduated from college with honors. In 2004, Xandra wrote Matt a letter saying that she wanted to break up. It was then that all the mean letters really began. One time, Matt sent Xandra an 8-page letter full of threats, all kinds of threats. He would say, "Just wait until I get out. If you don't come up here and straighten out between us, I'm not going anywhere, and neither are you. Maybe you need your ass kicked because I can really make you look ugly for life." He went on to tell her, "I told you that I can get vicious and ruthless when I need to, and all your space and ignorance is making things worse. For me, I'm sick of your space games and wanting things your way. This is not funny anymore. So if you don't start making time for me and making this bid comfortable for me until I get out, you're gonna regret that you ever met me. He also said, if you want to see some drama, then you're effing with the right man, because frankly, I don't give an F anymore. Because basically, you don't either. So if you can't get your ass up here and see me, well, I will make your life a miserable living hell. Those are quite some really nasty things. Matt also said that Xandra would never be able to hide, that he knew her social security number, and he would send risque photos of her to the bank, to her mom, dad, and brothers. Xandra knew if her private photos were put on the internet, it might be hard for her to achieve her acting dreams. The media is cruel like that sometimes. Matt wanted to ruin her reputation and threaten not only Xandra but her family as well. This wasn't the only time he had done this. Matt had a history of calling Xandra his property and assuming he had power over her. He threatened to erase her face. Xandra was terrified. These letters were deeply concerning. Recognizing the severity of this situation, Xandra took steps to ensure her well-being and safety. So with her mother's help, they decided to report the letters to the Department of Corrections. She decided to write her own letter to the corrections facility on January 23, 2004. She said she was scared for her life, and if Matt got out, she and her family would be in danger. The department actually took this matter very seriously and launched an entire investigation into the situation. Not only did they prohibit Matt from sending Xandra letters, but apparently this incident affected his original release date. He had to serve additional time. They extended Matt's sentence a couple of months longer and told Xandra they disciplined him, but this only made Matt more upset. When he was released in August of that year, apparently he had cooled down on his threats because nothing ever happened. He met Charisse, they moved in together, they got married, and soon she was pregnant with their baby Chastity. But Matt and Xandra still talked. They talked on the phone, and they even met up, but there was more to it. Xandra told Nicole in April she was scared of coming home at night because Matt might be hiding in her bushes. Xandra reported multiple domestic offenses before her murder, but she never got a restraining order. She didn't think Matt was seriously going to hurt her, yet in the end, he did what he said he was going to do. He erased her face. Matt went to trial 3 years later, in February of 2015, and it took so long because he cycled through several defense attorneys, and then he finally settled on Paul Cartney. In the opening statements, the prosecutor said this was a brutal crime of passion. Matt was clearly the culprit. But his defense attorney claimed that Xandra was getting threats from a man named Donovan, an entirely different person. Linda was the first person on the stand. She described Xandra and Matt's relationship. When Matt was calling every day from jail, Xandra was tired of it, and she wanted to move on. Linda intercepted a call and told Matt to stop calling and give her daughter some space. You know what he said back? You should really be careful about what you say and do, Linda said. Is that a threat? Matt said she could interpret it however she wanted. Linda suddenly realized the chokehold that he had over her daughter's life. She knew Xandra. She knew that Xandra liked to help people, and Xandra cared about Matt and felt sorry for him, but his cruelty made it impossible to cut him off. Her brother Eric also came forward. He said he took a call from Matt and encouraged him to move on. When he did this, Matt became aggressive and said he'd come see Eric as soon as he got out of jail, but it was an empty threat. Eric also said he had a conversation with Xandra in April, and she said, "I'm scared of what Matt might do." What was very interesting was the testimony from Matt's stepdaughter, Cha. She testified that he didn't come home on the morning of the 19th. She had woken up at 10 o'clock, and the house was completely empty, so he wasn't working out. She said if he were, she would have heard the sound of the dumbbells and his music, since the gym was only 20 feet from her bedroom. At 11 a.m., she left the house to get breakfast at a nearby diner, and she didn't see Matt's car in the driveway. Matt wasn't home. So what was he doing at that time? Jay also testified about everything we know that happened that day between him and Xandra, how they talked on the phone, how someone came to her door that she referred to as her ex-boyfriend, and it would make sense that it was Matt at her door. His phone records show that there was no call between them on the 19th. Matt wasn't supposed to come to her house because Linda didn't like when he dropped by. On February 17th, Matt's cousin Anthony testified that Matt had been plotting to kill Zandra for months. Matt had even told Anthony that Zandra had a big dog, but a dog he could handle. A big dog, but a sweetheart. There was no way that Anthony would have known about Zandra without talking to Matt. There were other witnesses. There were DNA witnesses on both sides, the defense and the prosecution. But Matt finally testified on his own behalf, and that's where things went very wrong for him, because his already shaky story got even shakier. He said that he left work that morning to check on his stepdaughter and to hang out with one of his girlfriends. So now he's saying he was cheating on the wife, the same wife that he was saying was the reason he wouldn't have been at Zandra's, because he didn't want to risk his marriage. He said after he left work, he stopped at the gas station before checking in on his stepdaughter. But wait a minute, he stopped there at 9:15. That doesn't match up with the evidence. The prosecution pointed out he had stopped at Hess at 2 o'clock, but Matt said, "No, I went out in the morning and the afternoon to get gas." But he wasn't caught on camera in the morning, and why would anyone have to fill up on gas twice in the same day? This time, he also admitted he had gone to Milford, another thing he said that he didn't do. He said he went to 5 different car dealerships all over, and one of them was in Milford. Then he said he went to a Kmart Plaza on Bridgeport Avenue to stop at a Radio Shack, and I'm going to show you this on the map. It's in Milford, but it's not far from Zandra's home. Well, of course, he was asked why he never admitted to being in Milford to begin with, and he blamed it on the detective, saying that Detective Yudd was using aggressive interview tactics, and he was scared he was going to get beaten up in the interrogation room. There was something else that they wanted to know about the electrical tape in his home. He said he got it from work to fix a car bumper after a wreck. The 12-person jury had a lot of deliberating to do, and it was a very hard job to decide on a verdict with all the limited information available. Everyone's testimony had holes in it one way or another. When they were deliberating, they actually asked Judge Denise Markle to hear Jay and Matt's testimonies again, and she agreed. Jay's story remained the same, but Matt's changed, and he ultimately dug his own grave. And you know why that was? Because in his testimony at trial, he finally admitted that he went to Zandra's house. He said at 12:20 he knocked on her door and they had a short conversation. He said he was a little angry, but they resolved their disagreement and he didn't kill her. If a person changes their story 5 times, there's probably something they're trying to hide. On March 2nd, 2015, after 3 days, the jury convicted Matthew Pugh of murder and burglary, and he was sentenced to 60 years for murder, that's the maximum sentence in Connecticut, and 20 years for burglary. Throughout this entire trial, Matt barely paid attention. He was reading a self-help book, and Zandra's dad was furious. He knew Matt didn't care about his daughter, and in his statement, he called Matt a despicable little person who had to have his 5 minutes of revenge. Not only did Matt try to take away Zandra's face, her beauty, and her power, he killed her in a place where he knew Linda would find her in order to emotionally destroy the entire family. Zandra's father went on to say that if the death penalty were legal, he would personally want to administer the injection. Of course, Matt tried to appeal his sentence, but his appeals were dismissed. There was something else I thought was interesting that came out at trial. On May 19th, the day that Zandra was murdered, Matt was on the Milford-Stratford line at 11:47, near Zandra's gym, and a few minutes later, when Zandra left the gym, Matt was in Stratford at 12:07 p.m. He was heading to Milford, driving in the same direction as Zandra's, and at 1:09, he was in Milford. He was following her every movement, trying to get her alone. This is what the prosecution believes happened the day that Zandra was killed. Matt shaved his head that morning. He took the day off from work. He didn't go home to check on his stepdaughter. He planned to kill Zandra that day. Matt knocked on her door, and at this point they had a conversation. I assume he went back to his car and prepared for the murder, and at 12:45 he jumped her at her front door. The gate was open, and Zandra ran outside. Matt dragged Zandra down to the basement, wearing 2 pairs of paper scrubs. and after he killed her, he cleaned up all the evidence. At 2 p.m., he dropped the evidence at a Hess gas station. In the end, all the evidence points to Matt. He had the motive, the means, and the opportunity. Xandra was a rising star. She was a beloved daughter, sister, and friend. She should not be remembered by what this evil monster did to her, but for her radiant personality and her genuine warmth. She was a blessing to anyone who had the privilege of knowing her. She possessed a unique beauty that went beyond physical appearance. She captivated the hearts of those around her. Her infectious spirit and unwavering kindness left a mark on the lives that she touched.